Winter in Victorian Britain wasn't just a season. It was an endurance test that came with its own soundtrack, a chorus of coughs echoing through fog-choked streets. The kind of cold that didn't politely nip your nose, but aggressively filed a complaint with every bone in your body. And yet somehow everyone acted as if this was perfectly fine. After all, nothing said respectable citizen quite like slowly freezing in the name of decorum. Hello, travellers! Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's set the scene. Picture London in December, a city wrapped in soot, not snow. The air so thick with coal smoke you could practically chew it. Your breath didn't fog. It merged with the industrial haze. Chimneys exhaled constantly, street lamps flickered like dying candles, and the Thames moved sluggishly under its own crust of ice. Even the rats looked cold, which was impressive, considering they lived rent-free in basements warmed by misery. The average Victorian home didn't have central heating, it had character. A single fireplace struggled valiantly in one room, while the rest of the house could double as a meat locker. Bedrooms were so cold that washing your face in the morning felt like an act of heroism. And the great irony? Windows were often left cracked open because stale air breeds sickness. Of course, this let in enough freezing drafts to turn sleep into a nightly survival sport. Clothing didn't help much either. Fashion was cruel, particularly for women. Layered petticoats trapped damp air, corsets limited circulation, and those elegant shawls? Decorative lies. Meanwhile, men strutted through blizzards in thin wool coats and pride, their breath forming small clouds of delusion. Gloves were optional, frostbite wasn't. The good news, you looked respectable. The bad news, your fingers were considering early retirement. Then there was the great Victorian obsession with appearances, which meant pretending not to be cold, even when your soul was shivering. If your teeth chattered, you discreetly blamed the London chill, not your lack of insulation. Stiff upper lip, frozen lower one. Street life was a winter carnival of coughs and sneezes. Vendors wrapped scarves around their faces like bandits. Children played in puddles that doubled as ice traps. Even the horses wore makeshift covers, because apparently humanity could neglect itself, but not its transport. The poor, of course, suffered worst. In slum housing, where window meant hole with ambition, families burned anything flammable, old shoes, newspaper, dignity, to stay alive. Coal cost money, and charity only went so far before it froze too. And yet the Victorians didn't merely endure winter. They romanticised it. Artists painted snowy scenes with cosy cottages glowing in lamplight, completely ignoring that real cottages had more drafts than windows. Poets wrote about frosty morns, as if chilblains were divine experiences. It was as if everyone agreed to collectively hallucinate that freezing to death was charming. Winter also dictated social behaviour. The upper class retreated to drawing rooms, hosting soirees beside roaring fires while servants fetched coal and frostbite. The middle class stocked up on remedies and handkerchiefs. The poor wrapped their hope in rags. And all of them, rich or poor, faced the same enemies. Influenza, bronchitis, pneumonia, the seasonal trio of doom. Doctors, of course, thrived in this chaos. Coughs, colds, and winter agues filled their appointment books. The human nose became their favourite client. If someone sneezed, it wasn't just a symptom, it was an opportunity. Medicine was less about curing and more about guessing creatively. But that's for later chapters. For now, winter itself was the disease. Even architecture didn't help. Those grand Victorian houses with high ceilings and tall windows looked elegant, sure, but they were about as heat efficient as a colander. Drafts whistled through hallways like ghosts of bad decisions. Ice formed on the inside of glass. Curtains froze to the wall. And still, people gathered proudly around their single flickering fire, sipping weak tea and pretending that hypothermia was a lifestyle choice. The streets, meanwhile, turned into obstacle courses of danger. Ice-coated cobblestones made walking an Olympic event. People slipped, horses fell, and carts crashed, and somehow doctors called it seasonal inconvenience. When snow did fall, it wasn't the romantic postcard kind. It was grey within hours, a grim sludge flavoured with coal soot and despair. But perhaps the most striking thing about the Victorian winter was its soundscape, the symphony of illness that rolled through every class and corner. From the delicate sniffle of a lady in lace to the hacking cough of a dock worker, every breath was an advertisement for the season's suffering. Newspapers even printed polite reminders for managing colds with composure, as if sneezing quietly could save one's soul. So when you imagine Victorian winter, don't picture a Dickensian wonderland. Picture survival with manners. People bundled up, drank questionable tonics, and prayed the cold would pass before they did. It was a season of endurance, vanity, and very little ventilation. A perfect breeding ground for the absurd medical practices that followed. Because in the next chapter we'll open the doctor's bag, and trust me, you'll wish it stayed closed. The good news? The fog hid your chapped face. The bad news? You couldn't see where you were freezing to death. Step inside the Victorian doctor's office, and the first thing you notice isn't the warmth or reassurance. It's the sound. Metal instruments clinking together like an orchestra of anxiety. The air smells faintly of camphor, sweat, and misplaced confidence. Somewhere a saw gleams in the corner, as if waiting to audition for a horror film. Welcome to Victorian medicine, half science, half courage test. Doctors in the 1800s loved their tools. They had forceps for grabbing, clamps for clamping, and saws for when grabbing and clamping didn't work. A medical kit might look impressive, polished brass, etched handles, neatly folded linen, but the cleanliness ended there. The same knife that sliced through a roast beef dinner might also slice through a femur the next morning. Sterilisation meant wiping the blade on one's sleeve and hoping for divine intervention. Every good Victorian doctor carried a case of essential instruments. Inside were scalpels, bone saws, tweezers, scissors, and occasionally a stethoscope, though some still considered it suspiciously foreign. There were also syringes the size of small trumpets, used for injecting things like mercury, morphine, or pure guesswork. And of course the pride of any surgeon's collection, the amputation saw. With a sharpness ratio rivaling a meat cleaver, it came in several styles, straight, curved, or bow, depending on how much drama the operation required. Now, don't imagine these tools as sterile marvels of precision. Imagine them as the metallic cousins of farm equipment. They were stored in velvet-lined boxes that looked like jewellery cases but screamed, "Today you lose a limb." And while doctors loved showing them off, especially in the public operating theatres, they often forgot to clean them properly. After all, infection wasn't yet understood. If a patient died afterward, it wasn't post-operative sepsis, it was unfortunate constitution. Smelling salts were another Victorian favourite. You fainted? No problem. Time for a deep whiff of ammonia strong enough to wake the dead, or at least make you wish you were. They were used for everything from fainting spells to fatigue to mild existential dread. If you were conscious, they still offered them, just to be sure. Then there was the leech jar, a decorative nightmare every respectable physician kept on hand. Leeches were medical celebrities, capable, supposedly, of sucking out any ailment. Fever, inflammation, heartbreak. They wriggled in glass jars on desks, waiting for their next unlucky appointment. Doctors believed that bad humours caused illness, and that removing a pint of your blood could fix almost anything. The logic was simple. If you feel weak, lose more blood. Feeling faint? Excellent, it's working. Cupping glasses were the Victorian cousin of modern spa treatments, except instead of relaxation, you got purple polka dots and confusion. Heated glass cups were applied to the skin to draw out impurities. In reality, they just left you looking like you'd wrestled an octopus. Still, they were used with enthusiasm on everything from frostbite to migraines. And let's not forget the trephine, a circular saw designed to remove sections of skull. Yes, brain surgery with a hand crank. The doctor would drill into the head to release pressure, as if the patient were a particularly stubborn jar lid. Anesthesia was inconsistent, so sometimes patients were merely held down and encouraged to think happy thoughts. You may feel a slight discomfort was Victorian code for "you'll remember this for several lifetimes." Of course, many doctors prided themselves on speed. A successful surgeon could amputate a leg in under a minute, and yes, this was something they bragged about. Medical journals recorded record times like Olympic events. Accuracy was optional, style was everything. One famous surgeon, Robert Liston, was said to have accidentally amputated his patient's leg and a bystander's fingers, both with impressive efficiency. Then there were the mysterious powders and tinctures cluttering every medical cabinet. Laudanum, pleasant mix of alcohol and opium, was the Victorian cure-all from headaches to heartbreaks. If you were coughing, sneezing, or simply existing, a spoonful of laudanum would make you stop caring. Arsenic tonics were also popular for strengthening the nerves. Ironically, they strengthen nothing except your connection to the afterlife. Even diagnosis was an art form. A doctor might examine your tongue, tap your chest, then declare, "Your humours are unbalanced." Translation, "I have no idea." Thermometers existed, but many still preferred to judge fever by touch or intuition. The stethoscope, invented decades earlier, was met with suspicion. Listening to the heart through a tube, one doctor scoffed. Unnatural. Others used it mostly as a prop to look professional, the 19th century version of carrying a clipboard. When not treating patients, doctors polished their instruments. It wasn't hygiene, it was presentation. A shiny scalpel impressed clients, even if it came with yesterday's germs. If it jingled and looked shiny, as one might say, it was probably considered sterile. Cleanliness was aesthetic, not medical. What kept patients coming back wasn't trust in the science, it was trust in the performance. Medicine was theatre, and the doctor was both star and stagehand. A steady voice, a confident hand, and a velvet-lined case of nightmares could convince anyone they were in good hands, even as those hands reached for the saw. By the end of the century, antiseptics and anaesthesia began creeping into practice. But for most Victorians, medical care still meant courage, luck, and a high pain tolerance. The doctor's bag was both salvation and sentencing tool, glittering proof that progress sometimes cuts both ways. The good news? The doctor had steady ends. The bad news? He was holding a saw. In the Victorian mind, catching frostbite wasn't just unfortunate, it was suspicious. Because in an age obsessed with morality, self-control and the illusion of progress, even freezing could be seen as a character flaw. The logic went something like this. If you were cold, you'd clearly fail to demonstrate the proper amount of moral fibre, and perhaps actual fibre too. The Victorians were masters at turning suffering into virtue. Hunger, character building. Poverty, a test from God. Hypothermia, probably deserved. To them, the human body wasn't just a physical machine, it was a moral compass. If you were freezing, it meant you lacked discipline, preparedness, or sufficient faith in providence. Warmth, meanwhile, was seen as the reward for good behaviour, financial prudence, and a properly aligned soul. This belief fit neatly into the grand tapestry of Victorian moral philosophy. A world where everything from illness to indigestion had a deeper meaning. The body was a battleground between virtue and vice. Sneezing too much might hint at poor hygiene, yes, but also poor judgment. And frostbite, well, perhaps you hadn't worked hard enough to afford more coal. Among the upper classes, the attitude was almost Darwinian, though they wouldn't admit it. If your toes turned black in winter, society's response was not sympathy, but a kind of chilly respect for natural selection. If he'd saved more from his wages, one might whisper, he'd have kept his feet. Charity existed, but only to soothe the conscience of the warm. Religious figures joined in too, preaching that cold was a test of the soul. Suffering through it with dignity was a sign of grace. Complaining about it, spiritual weakness. Sermons linked frostbite to sin. Cold of body reflects coldness of heart. The poor might have shivered, but they were told to be grateful their misery was building character, possibly for the afterlife, since this one offered little insulation. And then there was the pseudoscience, because no Victorian ailment was complete without a moral diagnosis in Latin. Physicians wrote solemn essays on the moral temperature of the constitution, arguing that people with weak willpower or nervous sensibility were more prone to frostbite. Some even suggested that degenerate individuals attracted cold like metal draws lightning. In short, if you were freezing, you weren't just unlucky, you were biologically unfashionable. The working class, of course, knew better. They didn't philosophize about cold, they lived it. Factory workers toiled in unheated spaces, their breath freezing before the steam from the machines. Street sweepers and coal porters spent hours in frost that made their hands crack open like parchment. But when illness struck, the newspapers blamed intemperance or idleness, as if frostbite came from moral laziness rather than a lack of shoes. And yet, the Victorians adored turning even misery into poetry. Writers like Thomas Carlyle and Samuel Smiles promoted the gospel of self-help, the idea that one's success, health, and presumably body temperature were all the result of effort. If you froze, clearly you hadn't smiled enough about it. Endure, and you shall overcome, they said. Unfortunately, frostbite doesn't negotiate with optimism. Among women, the moralization of cold took an even stranger turn. Fainting, shivering, and looking delicately pale were fashionable signs of refinement. But actual illness was still shameful. So women balanced dangerously close to hypothermia for the sake of beauty. Lace gloves in January, low-cut gowns in freezing parlours, and the ever-deadly winter stroll to show off one's composure. The result? A generation of women who caught chills while trying to look ethereal. The good news? They looked angelic. The bad news? They were halfway there. Children weren't spared either. Cold was supposed to toughen them up. Mothers bathed infants in icy water to fortify the spirit. Schoolmasters left classroom windows open for health. No one mentioned that the health benefit often ended in pneumonia. But in fairness, the Victorians believed almost anything could be cured by resolve or punished by lack of it. Even death from cold could be rebranded as moral instruction. Newspapers wrote obituaries describing the deceased as a soul too delicate for this harsh world, or, in harsher cases, a man undone by vice and neglect. In either version, the cold was not a killer. It was a messenger, delivering moral lessons wrapped in frost. Philosophically, this all tied into the grand Victorian obsession with self-control. The body was a moral object to be managed like a budget. Hunger suppressed, emotions moderated, temperature endured. Stoicism was the national sport. If you showed pain, you lost points. The frostbite on your fingers? A minor inconvenience compared to the embarrassment of admitting weakness. Suffer quietly, they said. The neighbours are listening. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity now, but in a society obsessed with progress, even freezing had to fit the narrative of improvement. Every shiver could be seen as a step toward moral refinement. Every blue finger a badge of resilience. In a world where suffering equalled virtue, frostbite wasn't just a hazard, it was practically a personality trait. Of course, beneath all this philosophy lurked irony. The same Victorians who preached endurance were the first to faint when faced with an unheated ballroom. They moralised coldness, yet built houses that trapped it perfectly. And they preached compassion, right up until the moment someone poor enough to be freezing asked for coal. So when we say Victorians debated frostbite, what we really mean is, they blamed it on you. Cold wasn't weather, it was judgment. You didn't need gloves, you needed redemption. The good news? You're freezing with dignity. The bad news? The frostbite doesn't care about your moral fibre. When it came to treating winter illness, most Victorians didn't rush to the doctor. They simply marched to the kitchen, that hallowed ground of culinary chaos and questionable cures. where half the nation's medical history was invented by desperate people holding spoons. The kitchen wasn't just where dinner happened, it was where hope simmered, where vinegar was both cleaner and cure, and where mustard had far more to do with pain than sandwiches. Victorian home remedies lived in that glorious grey area between chemistry and witchcraft. There was no symptom too severe that a determined housewife armed with staples couldn't treat. Fever? Onion poultice. Chills? Mustard plaster. Cough? Boiled turnip water. Heartbreak? Probably brandy. The unspoken rule of home medicine was simple. If it burned, stank or tasted like regret, it must be working. The most iconic of all Victorian concoctions was the mustard plaster, a homemade horror that generations swore by and swore at. To make it, one mixed mustard powder with water or vinegar, spread it on cloth and slapped it on the chest or back. The result? A sensation somewhere between tingly warmth and mild third-degree burn. The idea was to draw out bad humours by irritating the skin until the patient forgot what was wrong in the first place. The smell could empty a room faster than laudanum. Still, families kept mustard tins like gold because nothing said mother's love like chemical warfare applied by hand. Then there was vinegar, the Swiss Army knife of Victorian cures. Vinegar washed wounds, cleaned floors, flavoured pickles and, according to folk wisdom, killed germs, long before anyone knew what germs were. People gargled it for sore throats, soaked feet in it for frostbite, and sniffed it to revive fainting ladies. Some even bathed in it, believing it purified the system. Imagine sitting in a wooden tub of cold vinegar on a January night, your skin puckering, your dignity evaporating, and being told you'd feel better in the morning. The only thing cured was your will to live. Onions, meanwhile, were the unsung heroes of Victorian medicine. Chopped, boiled, fried, or worn like strange jewellery. A sore throat? Tie a roasted onion around your neck and wait. Chest congestion? Place one under your pillow. Earache? Shove one in your ear? Gently, one hopes. The smell was apocalyptic, but belief was strong. The onion drew out illness like a loyal vegetable servant. Entire families reeked of faith and sulphur all winter long. If a Victorian household smelled faintly of soup but had no dinner, you knew someone was recovering. Other ingredients joined the home remedy parade. Honey and lemon were used to soothe coughs, a rare example of something that actually worked, though the Victorians often ruined it by adding something poisonous for extra strength. Camphor, distilled from tree resin, was rubbed on chests, temples, and occasionally everything that moved. It tingled, burned, and smelled like medicinal pine trees, which, to a Victorian, meant success. If you were feeling adventurous, you might try turpentine, that all-purpose cure and furniture polish. Rubbing it on the frostbitten limbs was thought to restore circulation. It did, usually by setting your skin on fire. A more cautious patient might settle for goose grease, which was rubbed over chests to lock in warmth. Goose grease didn't heal much, but at least you were pre-buttered for the afterlife. Then came the poultices, warm, damp compresses made of whatever was handy, bread, oatmeal, herbs, or questionable ambition. They were applied to everything from boils to bronchitis. Each household had its own recipe, passed down like sacred lore. Grandmother's poultice cured your uncle's lungs, they would insist, skipping the part where Uncle George lost half his chest hair. And if the illness lingered, out came the hot toddy, whiskey, lemon and sugar disguised as medicine. Doctors frowned on drunkenness, but an alcoholic tonic was perfectly respectable. Families called it soothing the lungs, though in truth it soothed the patient into forgetting they had lungs at all. The toddy blurred the line between home treatment and celebration, a line Victorians crossed gladly by the third sip. Children weren't exempt from this homemade heroism. Parents fed them spoonfuls of castor oil, cleanses the system, or treacle mixed with sulphur for the blood. The experience was traumatic enough to cure future curiosity. Babies with colds were swaddled in hot flannel, greased with goose fat and guarded like soufflés. Mothers sat up through the night, holding spoons of syrup and muttering prayers to both God and chemistry. Every family had its miracle cure. Some swore by the charcoal water for stomach aches, others by burnt toast tea, which was exactly what it sounds like. Tea infused with blackened bread for digestive steadiness. You could even buy home remedy books filled with recipes like onions for virtue, mustard for courage, or how to boil away a fever. They were part cookbook, part experiment log, and entirely hopeful nonsense. Of course, not everyone survived their kitchen cures. Vinegar baths led to pneumonia, turpentine rubbed on frostbite made burns worse, and mustard plasters left scars. But the intent was pure. These remedies came from a world that didn't trust doctors, couldn't afford apothecaries, and still believed that nature had all the answers, even if nature occasionally screamed when applied. Yet the faith in these homemade treatments built something remarkable, a sense of control. In a time when science was still guessing, people needed to do something, even if that something involved rubbing mustard on their ribs. The kitchen became a laboratory, a battlefield, and a shrine. Each remedy was part science, part superstition, and part comedy. So next time you reach for cold medicine, be grateful you don't have to first boil an onion and smear it on your chest. The Victorians might not have cured their illnesses, but they mastered the art of trying loudly, creatively, and often fragrantly. The good news? The mustard plaster is working. The bad news? So is the fire hazard. Step into a Victorian apothecary and you'll immediately feel both reassured and alarmed. The air smells of something vaguely floral but mostly chemical, as if perfume and death are having a polite duel. Behind the counter stands a man in a crisp waistcoat, part pharmacist, part magician, part enthusiastic gambler with your organs. Welcome to the Victorian pharmacy, where science met showmanship and the cure was often more dangerous than the disease. The apothecary's winter shelves were a glittering display of dubious hope. Rows of glass jars, each with elegant handwritten labels, promised salvation. Tincture of opium, spirit of ammonia, mercurial ointment, camphorated oil. The sight alone was impressive enough to make customers trust whatever was inside, which was fortunate, because the average Victorian had no idea what any of it did, and frankly neither did the apothecary half the time. One of the most beloved items was laudanum, the Victorian version of take two and forget your problems. A syrupy mixture of opium and alcohol, laudanum was medicine, sedative and existential escape all in one. It was prescribed for coughs, insomnia, headaches, period cramps, heartbreak, and occasionally boredom. Children teething? Laudanum. Husband complaining? Laudanum. Cat acting weird? Give it some laudanum? Yes, even pets got dosed. It soothed everyone, mostly because it made them unconscious. Entire generations floated through winter on laudanum dreams. It was sold over the counter in pretty bottles, sweetened with sugar, and labelled with gentle encouragements like for restless nights. By the time the side effects hit, addiction, confusion, or sudden death, it was too late to complain. Writers and artists adored it. Housewives depended on it. One dose, and your cough disappeared into a soft, poetic haze. The good news, you stopped coughing. The bad news, you might also stop breathing. Next on the shelf stood camphor, the all-purpose elixir of Victorian optimism. Extracted from the wood of Asian camphor trees, it was believed to heal everything short of heartbreak. Apothecaries sold it as crystals, oils, and rubs. Camphor liniment was rubbed on chests to stimulate circulation, inhaled for colds, and applied to frostbite. An ironic treatment, since camphor's burning chill could make frostbite worse. Still, the smell alone was enough to convince people something was happening. Every Victorian home smelled faintly of camphor, like a forest trying to cover up a murder. Then came opium, laudanum's more direct cousin. It was sold raw, powdered, and in convenient pills for the respectable sufferer. Doctors prescribed it liberally, especially in winter when coughs and pains multiplied. Opium soothed the nerves, dulled the lungs, and occasionally introduced patients to the afterlife. But it was also fashionable. To the Victorians, opium wasn't a vice, it was a lifestyle. Poets praised its dreamy visions. Society ladies took tonics laced with it and called it wellness. The mercury compounds, however, were in a class of their own, quite literally toxic elegance. Mercury was the wonder metal of the 19th century, shiny, fluid, mysterious, and catastrophically poisonous. It was mixed into ointments for frostbite, syphilis, and general weakness. Apothecaries even sold blue pills made with mercury chloride, promising to cleanse the system. They did, along with your sanity. Chronic mercury users developed trembling hands, swollen gums, and a charming habit of forgetting where they lived. But they glowed with that distinctive healthy pallor society admired, which made it all worth it. On the lower shelves sat the more respectable tonics, ammonia spirits, chloroform, cod liver oil, and quinine. Ammonia was a favourite winter pick-me-up, one sniff, and your sinuses exploded open like fireworks. Chloroform, meant for surgery, was occasionally repurposed by over-enthusiastic households for headaches. And cod liver oil, thick and fishy, was the winter cure for everything, from rickets to melancholy. "It's good for you," mothers insisted, as children plotted rebellion. The apothecary himself was half chemist, half showman. He wore spectacles of authority, mixed powders like a wizard, and spoke in the soothing tones of someone who absolutely should not be trusted. Customers came in with symptoms, and he prescribed confidently, sometimes based on knowledge, sometimes on what jar looked impressive that day. The clink of glass, the swirl of coloured liquids, the promise of relief. It was theatre. Labels were poetry, invigorating nerve drops, lung balm of the East, tonic for delicate constitutions. Every bottle sounded like a miracle in liquid form. In reality, most contained alcohol, opium, or both. The Victorian trifecta of feeling better immediately. But no one questioned the ingredients. Why would they? The apothecary's shelves sparkled like a promise. And in a world where illness felt endless, promises were potent medicine. Winter was their busiest season. Cough syrup sold faster than coal. Parents lined up for tinctures for their children, unaware they were essentially buying morphine in molasses. Even advertisements in newspapers blurred the line between health and addiction. Soothes the lungs, calms the mind, restores the spirit. Indeed it did, permanently in some cases. And yet, the apothecary wasn't a villain. He was a product of his time, a man with a mortar, pestle, and an overwhelming faith in chemistry. To the Victorians, science was progress, and progress always tasted faintly of alcohol and despair. Apothecaries were community pillars. They mixed, measured, and occasionally guessed their way through epidemics, always with charm and confidence. Of course, accidents happened. Wrong labels, wrong measurements, wrong corpse. But families kept returning because the alternative, untreated illness, was worse. A bottle from the apothecary was a symbol of care, even if it occasionally came with mercury garnish. By the late 19th century, regulations began creeping in. Labels started to include words like poison and caution, though in font so decorative they were easy to miss. Still, the apothecary's winter shelf remained the heart of Victorian medicine, a glittering arsenal of oblivion wrapped in glass. So the next time you pop a painkiller or cough drop, remember, your great-great-grandparents were dosing themselves with liquid opium and mercury and calling it self-care. And somehow through sheer luck and liver strength, humanity survived. The good news, the apothecary's potion stopped your cough. The bad news, it also stopped your pulse. Frostbite was the Victorian winter's silent thief. It crept up on the poor, the soldiers, and the unfortunate chimney sweeps like a polite assassin armed with icicles. To lose a finger or two was practically a seasonal tradition. And yet, in true Victorian fashion, people managed to treat the loss of body parts with a stiff upper lip, sometimes literally frozen in place. Let's start with what frostbite looked like to a 19th century Londoner. The first signs were easy to miss. because everyone was numb already. Toes tingled, fingers stiffened, noses turned purple, and before you knew it, bits of you were auditioning for most likely to detach. The medical term local asphyxia made it sound dignified, but there was nothing noble about watching your foot turn the colour of overripe plums. For the working poor, frostbite wasn't a freak accident. It was a routine hazard. Workhouse inmates lived in rooms so cold the soup froze before it was eaten. Shoes were optional luxuries, blankets threadbare, and coal fires reserved for managers' offices. When inmates complained of pain in their extremities, overseers often replied, "Work harder, it'll warm you up," a philosophy both motivational and medically disastrous. Many left the workhouse with fewer toes than they entered, proof that charity in the Victorian era came with conditions. Then there were the chimney sweeps, those soot-covered acrobats of the industrial skis. Imagine climbing a freezing chimney at dawn, the brick still slick with last night's frost, your body barely clothed and your hands cracked open from cold and soot. Frostbite for them wasn't about a temperature, it was about survival. If their fingers stiffened mid-climb, they could fall to their deaths, and if they didn't fall, the cold made sure their skin blistered, blackened and peeled. Occupational hazard doesn't quite cover it. Slow freeze by employment comes closer. The soldiers, meanwhile, faced frostbite on an industrial scale. Campaigns during the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, turned frozen limbs into patriotic sacrifices. Reports from the battlefield spoke of men sleeping on snow, boots frozen to their feet, and medics restoring circulation with methods that sounded like medieval torture, snow rubbing, open fires, or even plunging frozen limbs into brandy. The brandy helped morale, if not the toes. Many soldiers returned home heroes, minus some fingers. A letter from one British private famously read, "We were told to keep warm, but the only warmth available was dying." In Arctic expeditions, frostbite was practically a membership badge. Victorian explorers treated losing toes as proof of manliness. The more digits you lost, the more glorious your adventure. Newspapers praised frostbitten explorers as noble sufferers in pursuit of progress, as if blackened flesh were a medal. Behind the heroics, though, the treatment was grim. Doctors often amputated on the spot, using saws that looked more appropriate for carpentry. Anaesthetic was optional, whiskey was cheaper. For the middle class, frostbite was less about physical danger and more about humiliation. To suffer frozen fingers suggested carelessness, or worse, a lack of financial insulation. Gentlemen prided themselves on fine leather gloves, terrible at warmth, excellent at style. Ladies wore silk shoes that might as well have been invitations for hypothermia. To admit to frostbite was to confess to unfashionable suffering. The polite solution was denial. Blue fingers were called circulatory delicacies. Black toes were the result of draft exposure. And if one happened to lose a digit, well, gloves were in vogue anyway. Doctors had no shortage of advice on frostbite. The general rule was, do something, preferably dramatic. Some recommended rubbing the affected area with snow, the idea being that freezing it more would somehow make it less frozen. Others suggested plunging it in cold water, which conveniently achieved the same level of failure with added shock. A few more progressive physicians proposed gradual warming near a fire, though in practice gradual often turned into charbroiled. The Victorian version of do no harm sometimes read like a dare, and yet frostbite was more than just a medical crisis. It was a social mirror. Each case revealed who could afford heat and who couldn't. For the rich, frostbite was a tale to tell at dinner parties. "Ah yes, I nearly lost my ear in Scotland last winter. Terribly invigorating." For the poor, it was the price of existing outdoors too long. In cities like London and Manchester, winters were deadly equalisers. Street sweepers, dock workers and beggars all risked freezing solid by morning. Newspapers occasionally published sentimental sketches of frozen souls found on doorsteps, equal parts pity and propaganda. "Moral lesson, save your soul before your fingers," they wrote. The irony was as thick as the frost itself. What's remarkable is how people normalised it. Losing a few digits wasn't unusual, it was just part of winter's math. Shoemakers crafted accommodation boots for people missing toes. Soldiers joked about the price of loyalty. Even artists romanticised frostbite. Painters depicted pale hands and rosy cheeks as symbols of endurance, not gangrene. Victorians turned suffering into art because the alternative was admitting how preventable it all was. In the end, frostbite didn't just destroy flesh, it revealed society's own cold heart. The wealthy insulated themselves with philosophy, the poor with rags, and the rest with denial. But in every class, someone looked down at their numb hands and wondered if warmth was ever coming back. And if you're wondering how they kept their spirits up through all this, the answer is simple. Humour, whiskey, and denial. The three pillars of Victorian medicine. The good news, you've joined an exclusive club. The bad news, membership costs a few fingers. Few sights alarmed Victorians quite like a person who'd gone stiff in the cold near the door. Not metaphorically, but literally. The empire might have been industrialising, but when it came to first aid, the average rescuer's knowledge hovered somewhere between enthusiasm and assault. Thawing the frozen wasn't just a medical challenge, it was a social event, a test of creativity, and occasionally a great way to make things worse. Victorians approached frostbite and hypothermia the same way they approached everything else, with confidence, guesswork, and a faint smell of brandy. The rule of thumb was simple. If something looked dead, heat it until it wasn't. This philosophy produced a dizzying variety of treatments, most of which sounded like pranks gone too far. Let's begin with the most infamous technique. Rubbing the victim with snow. Yes, you read that correctly. When someone was frozen, Victorians thought the solution was more freezing. Doctors argued that this gentle friction with snow prevented sudden warming, which could shock the system. In reality, it shredded the skin and drove frost deeper. Imagine being half dead with cold and having your friends enthusiastically exfoliate you with a snowdrift. It was less medical intervention, more seasonal bullying, yet medical manuals swore by it. Rub briskly, they said. If the patient protests continue, it is a sign of returning vitality. Which was true, because no one enjoys being sanded back to life. Then there was the fire method, beloved by those who mistook proximity to flames for medicine. Families would drag the half-frozen victim indoors, strip them down and position them dangerously close to the hearth. Sometimes they held out hands and feet directly over the fire, cheerfully remarking that a little smoke brings the colour back. Indeed it did. Black. Flesh cooked faster than the doctor could arrive, and burns were hailed as signs of improvement. He's pinking up, they'd say, unaware the pink was permanent. For the more refined household, there was the hot water treatment, a misadventure in Victorian thermodynamics. The patient's limbs were plunged into basins of warm water, which soon turned scalding because warmth was a vague concept. Some manuals recommended starting with snow, then moving to water, then fire, a progression that reads less like medical advice and more like a recipe for regret. One London physician noted proudly that he had saved several fingers this way, though his patients suffered most heroically, which was Victorian for scream the wallpaper off. And of course, no treatment list was complete without whiskey. If someone was cold, give them whiskey. If someone wasn't cold, also give them whiskey for prevention. Brandy, rum, gin, the Victorians believed alcohol warmed the blood, though in reality it thinned it and hastened hypothermia. Sailors returning from Arctic missions swore by it, often because it was the only thing keeping them interested in living. A staggering number of frostbite victims perished smiling faintly, convinced they were warming up. In a sense, they were just not in the way they hoped. There were also domestic innovations. One popular trick was wrapping the frozen person in blankets fresh from the oven. Another was burying them in warm manure, because farmers noticed livestock revived that way. If the patient lived, it was called a triumph of rustic wisdom. If not, well, at least the smell covered the disappointment. Urban Victorians developed their own variations. In factories and railway stations, kind strangers would bundle an unconscious person in sacks or pile hot bricks around them. It worked, provided the bricks didn't catch the blankets on fire. Hospitals were little better. Patients were laid near radiators, new inventions at the time, that often overheated, leading to burns that doctors described as the lesser evil. In the age of steam, everything was heated aggressively, including people. The real danger, however, came not from the methods themselves, but from misunderstanding the problem. Victorians thought frostbite and hypothermia were the same thing, freezing of the blood. The goal, therefore, was to liquefy it again. No one quite knew that warming too fast could send toxins rushing into the system. They just assumed that if you could melt butter, you could melt a man. Medical texts from the mid-19th century are full of contradictions. Some advised vigorous rubbing with snow or salt. Others insisted on immersion in ice-cold water to restore natural reaction. A few daring modernists suggested wrapping the patient in dry wool and warming gradually, but those voices were drowned out by traditionalists shouting, "More friction!" Every new doctor had his own method, and usually enough confidence to defend it until someone died. The truly unlucky patients were those treated by amateur Good Samaritans in the street. Passers-by would gather, debating whether to rub, pour or drag. One might fetch hot tea while another poured boiling water directly on the victim's boots. Someone always produced brandy because Victorian first aid without alcohol was unthinkable. By the time a doctor arrived, the patient was either miraculously alive or impressively parboiled. Yet despite the chaos, something endearingly human ran through it all. People tried. They didn't understand thermoregulation or tissue necrosis, but they refused to let a fellow sufferer freeze alone. They'd rub, warm, pour and pray, often in that order. And once the patient revived, there was celebration. "See," they'd boast, "a little friction never hurt anyone." It had frequently, but optimism was the era's strongest drug. The few who survived such enthusiastic thawing often carried lifelong scars, some physical, some emotional, and some just frostbite-shaped punchlines at winter gatherings. Still, they were proof that in a world of improvised medicine, luck was often the most effective cure. By the turn of the century, medical science began catching up. Doctors learned to thaw gently to avoid alcohol and to stop rubbing people like frozen turkeys. But in the height of Victorian winter, if you collapsed in the snow, your fate depended entirely on who found you first, a gentle nurse with blankets or an overzealous neighbour with a bucket of whiskey and a fireplace poker. The good news? They warmed you up. The bad news? You're medium rare. You things confused the Victorians more than air. They lived in a century obsessed with it, smelling it, fearing it, bottling some to it, and occasionally trying to weaponize it against illness. To them, air wasn't just atmosphere. It was moral judgment and gas form. A whiff of bad air could numb your soul, but a breeze through the window might save your lungs, provided you were the right social class to survive it. At the heart of the confusion was the infamous miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad smells rather than germs. If the air stank, it was deadly. If it smelled sweet, you were safe. This made cities like London and Manchester, which smelled like boiled sewage and ambition, constant medical emergencies. Doctors solemnly declared that foul vapours caused everything from cholera to the common cold. Public health was essentially an air freshener campaign. Governments responded by focusing less on sanitation and more on scent control. Perfumed handkerchiefs became armour against invisible evil. Ladies pressed them to their faces while passing poor neighbourhoods, convinced one deep inhale of poverty could ruin their complexion. Gentlemen stuffed orange peels in their pockets for the same reason, not to smell pleasant, but to avoid smelling fatal. The result was a society perpetually sniffing fruit and blaming the breeze for its problems. Yet paradoxically, these same doctors also worshipped fresh air as a cure for nearly everything. Too much foul air made you sick, but so did too little of the good kind. The only problem? No one could agree on what fresh meant. Some insisted it was mountain air, crisp and biting. Others preferred sea air, briny and invigorating. The poor, naturally, were stuck with domestic air, also known as soot. Victorian hospitals were prime battlegrounds for this fresh air obsession. Early wards were sealed like tombs to keep out noxious draughts. When patients suffocated on their own stale breath, doctors simply nodded gravely and blamed weak constitutions. Later reformers, like Florence Nightingale, flipped the script, insisting that open windows and ventilation saved lives. Nurses flung windows open, even in January, filling wards with what patients described as a refreshing kind of pneumonia. The cure often felt worse than the disease. In homes, the debate raged on, and every respectable household had a family member who appointed themselves air commander, forever lecturing about proper ventilation. Too much air and you'd catch your death. Too little and you'd mildew internally. Parents argued over bedroom windows like diplomats at war. Some swore sleeping with an open sash cured headaches. Others believed it invited tuberculosis in for tea. Curtains flapped in passive-aggressive defiance of medical uncertainty. The middle class took this philosophy outdoors, inventing the health walk. Wrapped in scarves and optimism, Victorians marched through city parks believing each gust purified the soul. Doctors prescribed seaside trips to breathe in ozone, a mysterious element no one understood but everyone agreed was good for you. By the 1870s, entire industries revolved around selling fresh air, sanatoriums, seaside boarding houses, even lung resorts in the Alps. If you were rich and coughing, someone would gladly charge you a fortune to breathe somewhere else, but for the poor, fresh air meant something entirely different: exposure. The same doctors who praised fresh breezes for aristocrats condemned drafts for labourers. When a factory worker fell ill, they were told their damp lodgings had poisoned the air. When a duchess fell ill, she was sent to Italy for the climate. It wasn't about air quality, it was about class quality. Rich air healed, poor air killed. The molecules themselves, it seemed, respected social hierarchy. And then came Victorian architecture, the ultimate enemy of logic. Houses were designed with high ceilings and long corridors to circulate air, but the result was rooms colder than a Scottish apology. Windows were ornamental, opened briefly for moral satisfaction, then sealed before Frostbite could file a complaint. Coal smoke from nearby chimneys drifted inside, mixing with candle soot and human breath to create a cocktail that could knock out a canary. But no one worried, because it smelled respectable. Even the fashionable invalids, pale, poetic souls suffering from delicate lungs, were caught in this breeze-based contradiction. They were told to sit outdoors to strengthen their constitution, even in midwinter. Fresh air fortifies the spirit, doctors proclaimed, handing them blankets and false hope. Sketches from the era show men and women reclining on balconies, bundled like leftovers, while servants scraped frost off their tea trays. For some, the cure was indistinguishable from the disease. Meanwhile, air itself became a business. Entrepreneurs bottled mountain air in glass jars and sold it to city dwellers. Ads promised pure alpine freshness for a few shillings a sniff. No one asked how air stayed pure after a week in transit. It didn't matter. Inhaling imported weather was a status symbol. The true measure of wealth wasn't what you owned, but what you breathed. As the century progressed, science began spoiling the fun. Germ theory crept onto the scene, suggesting maybe, just maybe, it wasn't smells making everyone sick, but microscopic hitchhikers. Doctors were sceptical. Invisible creatures? Absurd, they said, while continuing to treat tuberculosis by moving patients closer to the window. Even after Pasteur's discoveries, old habits lingered. Fresh air remained sacred, a Victorian superstition with excellent PR. The irony, of course, was that fresh air was sometimes helpful, especially in cities filled with coal smoke and open sewers. But the Victorians managed to turn even this truth into class theatre. Air became moral currency. The upper class escaped to the countryside to take the air, while the poor inhaled whatever the factories exhaled. The same element that symbolised purity for some spelled pneumonia for others. In the end, Victorian air was less about oxygen and more about identity. To breathe well was to live well. To cough was to confess poverty. And so the entire empire existed in a constant state of respiratory anxiety, opening windows, closing them again, and arguing about which direction the breeze was coming from. The good news, fresh air builds character. The bad news, so does hypothermia. If hell had paperwork, it would have looked like a Victorian workhouse hospital, designed less for healing and more for moral correction. These institutions were where Britain sent the sick poor to think about what they'd done, namely existing without sufficient income. You didn't go there for comfort, you went there because there was nowhere else left to go. The only thing thinner than the blankets was the soup, and the only thing thicker than the walls was the hypocrisy. Victorian society believed poverty wasn't a condition, it was a choice. Illness, therefore, was simply poor decision-making manifesting physically. Enter the workhouse hospital, a place that combined equal parts to medicine, hiss, punishment, and sermonizing. Established under the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, workhouses were supposed to provide refuge for the destitute. In practice, they were deterrents, places so dreadful that the threat of ending up in one was supposed to keep you productive, healthy, and firmly outside. Picture it, a sprawling stone building squatting under the grey sky, with barred windows, echoing corridors, and doors that shut with bureaucratic finality. Inside, patients lay in long wards, men, women and children, all separated by gender, class, and sometimes by whether their cough sounded morally suspicious. Beds were narrow, straw-filled, and shared by the desperate. The heating system consisted of hope. The smell? A mix of disinfectant, cabbage, and despair. Doctors here were usually overworked, underpaid, and occasionally sober. Many were barely trained, or apprentices of apprentices, while the true professionals preferred private practice, where patients could actually pay for survival. Treatments were limited. The medical budget often ran out before the winter did. When supplies dwindled, the staff got creative. Coughs were treated with watered-down gin, wounds with vinegar, and morale with lectures about thrift. The first step upon entering a workhouse hospital was decontamination of dignity. You were bathed, often publicly, shaved, and issued a coarse uniform that made prison stripes look stylish. Personal belongings were confiscated, and even wedding rings. Family members were separated by gender and age, so husbands and wives couldn't see each other again until one of them died. It was a system designed for efficiency, not humanity. We mustn't encourage dependency, officials said, confusing mercy with moral decay. Food was served 3 times a day, though served might be generous. Breakfast, porridge resembling grey cement. Lunch, soup thin enough to read through. Dinner, bread that could double as insulation. Calories were rationed like compassion. Nurses, often untrained pauper women themselves, doled out meals with wooden ladles and weary eyes. For the sick, extra portions were technically allowed, but the paperwork to approve them often took longer than the illness itself. And yet, the workhouse hospital had its own grim rhythm. Patients coughed in unison, the floorboards creaked like a communal pulse. Silence was mandatory, except for prayers. The resident chaplain appeared regularly, armed with moral prescription rather than medical ones. Your suffering, he'd assure the patients, is God's test of virtue. Conveniently, it was also the government's way of saving money on heating. The idea was that spiritual warmth compensated for physical cold. Unsurprisingly, no one felt particularly redeemed. The treatment methods were as austere as the surroundings. Fever? Bleed them a little, or a lot. Weakness? Feed them tonic wine. Alcohol was cheaper than vitamins. Frostbite? Bandage and forget. Amputation? Done quickly and preferably quietly. There was no anaesthesia, but there was prayer. Doctors encouraged stoicism, which was fortunate, because there were no alternatives. If the patient survived, they were congratulated on their moral fibre. If they died, they were praised for their humility. The record-keeping was immaculate. Every admission, discharge, and death was logged in beautiful copperplate handwriting. Bureaucracy was the one thing the Victorians could do with precision. A patient could vanish into the ground, but their paperwork lived forever. Inspectors toured the wards, nodding approvingly at orderliness while stepping over actual bodies. Reports would later note that conditions are satisfactory, which in workhouse language meant not currently on fire. Children fared no better. Sick orphans were placed in the same wards as the elderly, taught early that sympathy was a limited resource. Their coughs blended with the groans of adults, the lullaby of institutional suffering. Many learned quickly not to cry. The tears froze before they made any difference. And if a child died, there was always another to replace them. Victorian poverty had excellent supply chains. Ironically, these hospitals were occasionally lauded as examples of reform. Inspectors praised the cleanliness achieved through freezing temperatures that discouraged bacterial life, and the moral uplift of the system. Middle-class visitors left impressed. "They seem so orderly," they'd remark, unaware that the patients were too weak to rebel. Charity galas were held to raise funds for improvements, most of which went towards more sermons or slightly less lumpy gruel. Still, despite the cruelty, not every workhouse was entirely monstrous. Some matrons and doctors genuinely cared, fighting uphill battles against poverty and policy. They smuggled extra blankets, slipped patients bits of bread, and looked the other way when rules were bent. In those rare moments, compassion flickered like a candle in the draughty halls, small, fragile, but real. By the late Victorian era, reformers began demanding change. Writers like Charles Dickens had dragged the horrors of the system into public view. Gradually, workhouse infirmaries evolved into municipal hospitals, and the worst abuses faded into history, replaced by new forms of bureaucratic neglect. Progress, Victorian style, slightly warmer misery. Looking back, the workhouse hospital was less a place of healing and more a monument to social fear, the fear of idleness, dependency, and human frailty. It treated poverty as infection and compassion as contagion. The walls may have been stone, but the real architecture was moral panic. If you were poor and sick in Victorian Britain, your best hope wasn't medicine. It was luck, or a rich relative with poor aim and generous inheritance. Because within those cold corridors of care, survival wasn't guaranteed, but judgment certainly was. The good news, you're finally warm in the fever ward. The bad news, they charge extra for blankets that work. In the hierarchy of Victorian misery, illness came with class privileges. For the working poor, disease was punishment. For the wealthy, it was personality. The difference wasn't the bacteria, it was the decor. A cold in the East End meant a lost week's wages. A cold in Mayfair meant an opportunity to redecorate your sick room in 7 tasteful shades of suffering. The upper classes treated sickness the way they treated everything else, as a performance. A well-timed illness demonstrated refinement, sensitivity, and the moral stamina to endure delicate health with grace. You weren't bedridden, you were gracefully convalescing. Every sigh was a statement. Every faint was fashionable. While the poor died of bronchitis, the rich retired for the season. Their illnesses even had names tailored for elegance. Tuberculosis was consumption, romantic, poetic, almost spiritual. Depression became melancholia. Influenza was the fashionable complaint, and chills, always delicate. The word sick was never used, it was vulgar. You were indisposed or unwell or resting under doctor's orders. The very language of illness was perfumed to sound genteel. The upper-class sick room was a theatre of luxury and leisure. Picture a grand bedroom draped in heavy velvet curtains, the air thick with lavender water and money. A fire burned low, tended by servants who moved like shadows, ensuring their mistress's shawl never slipped. The patient reclined on silk pillows, surrounded by half-read novels, fruit baskets and flowers imported from places where people had real problems. The medicine cabinet sparkled with bottles of laudanum, tonic wine, and patent elixirs, each chosen for its aesthetic more than its chemistry. Their doctors, of course, were men of prestige. A physician to the wealthy needed not just medical skill, which was negotiable, but impeccable manners and handwriting that could double as art. They arrived in horse-drawn carriages, smelling faintly of success and disinfectant, and delivered diagnoses in sonorous tones. "Madam," they'd declare, "you suffer from nervous exhaustion, the price of too much brilliance." Translation: "You're bored, but expensively so. Fees were extravagant, but discretion was free. A good doctor knew how to flatter as much as he treated. If a working-class man coughed blood, it was tuberculosis. If a countess did, it was a strain upon her delicate constitution. Wealth didn't just buy comfort, it bought vocabulary. Some illnesses, like gout, were almost aspirational. Caused by overeating and fine wine, gout became the badge of a man who'd lived well. He's suffering from excess, society murmured approvingly, as if gluttony were a medical degree. For the women of high society, illness became both lifestyle and escape. The constant expectations of social grace, corsetry, and emotional restraint made delicate health a perfect refuge. Fainting couches were as essential to interior design as wallpaper. When conversation grew dull, one could always swoon dramatically, an elegant way to exit a party and secure sympathy. Fainting wasn't just tolerated, it was trend-setting. A woman's fragility was her finest accessory. Their treatments were as opulent as their ailments. Spa retreats in Bath or Buxton promised healing through mineral waters and gossip. Seaside cures sent invalids to Brighton or Scarborough to breathe restorative ozone, wrapped in furs and disapproval of the working class. For those with a penchant for adventure, alpine sanatoriums offered both fresh mountain air and bragging rights. "The Alps," one lady wrote, "have done wonders for my lungs, though the servants detest the altitude." Then there were the domestic cures, tailored to taste. Electric belts promised to stimulate the nerves. Arsenic wafers brightened complexions and dimmed life expectancy. For the truly fashionable, there was the electromagnetic chair, which zapped patients into believing progress was happening. If it hummed, buzzed, or glowed, it was medicine. The Victorian elite were early adopters of pseudoscience, provided it came in mahogany packaging. Their diets also reflected their hierarchy of health. Doctors warned against overindulgence, so meals were adjusted in ways that would starve an ox but delight an artist. Weak tea, dry toast, and calf's foot jelly were staples of convalescence. Some invalids lived almost entirely on consommé and moral superiority. Servants fed them in silver spoons while they lamented the trials of existence. Curious contrast to the workhouse patients across town who would have traded a limb for that same bowl of jelly. Illness even became social currency. Hosting an invalid in one's drawing room signalled compassion and taste. Friends sent ornate get-well baskets, containing books, biscuits, and sometimes small pets. The sick were visited in clusters, not to help, but to gossip gently about how pale they looked. Being bedridden was a networking opportunity, complete with guest lists and polite candlelight. For men, being sick could enhance gravitas. A baron recovering from pneumonia was suddenly profound. A politician with a nervous condition became a visionary burdened by responsibility. Coughing in public was a power move, proof that one worked too hard for the nation's good. The poor coughed from soot, the rich coughed from destiny. Even death looked better with money. Funerals for the wealthy were serene affairs with mourning clothes, velvet hearses, and tasteful sobbing. The obituary would describe their passing as peaceful or bravely born. Compare that to the pauper's grave, where the same disease was called a result of neglect, the same bacteria, but wildly different PR. By the late Victorian era, medical science began catching up, and the rich, always ahead of the trend, adopted scientific living. They installed air baths, invested in sanatorium shares, and bragged about owning the latest stethoscope-like contraptions. They still got sick, of course, but they got sick fashionably. The irony of it all? The same class that spent fortunes avoiding drafts and drinking imported tonics was also the one promoting moral toughness to the poor. They preached hard work and restraint, while recovering in chaise lounges from the strain of having opinions. In the end, illness in the Victorian upper class wasn't just about health, it was theatre, performed with lace, managed by servants, and narrated by doctors who billed by the adjective. The poor fought disease, the rich curated it. The good news, you've got the same cough as the common man. The bad news, his doesn't come with a personal physician and decorative curtains. If you were unlucky enough to catch something during a Victorian winter, and luck was the only reliable medicine available, you could always rely on the next best thing, a quack doctor. They appeared just when the coughs began echoing through the streets, armed with tonics, promises, and suspiciously shiny teeth. Their wagons rattled into towns like travelling circuses of hope and hazard, promising miracles bottled in glass and nonsense. Quackery wasn't just common, it was an empire. In an age before strict medical licensing and truth in advertising laws, the line between doctor and salesman was thinner than a Victorian soup. Anyone with a loud voice, an impressive moustache and a convincing Latin label could become a professor of pulmonary science. No degree required, just a flair for drama and a knack for not blushing while lying. The winter season was their high holiday. Frostbite colds, chill fevers and seasonal melancholy meant a booming market for anyone who could sell the illusion of warmth in a bottle. The quack's wagon was a spectacle, painted with golden lettering like Dr. Marvel's restorative elixir for man and beast, or Sir Horatio Blenkinsop's celebrated balsam of immortality. Trumpets blared, banners fluttered, and curious crowds gathered, half sceptical, half desperate. Because in the Victorian winter, scepticism froze faster than hope. The show always began with a speech. Standing on a makeshift stage, often a crate once used to ship dubious tonics, the quack would proclaim his credentials, graduate of the Parisian Academy of Vital Energies, which sounded impressive mostly because no one could check. He'd produce a live testimony, a coughing local who, after one sip, miraculously leapt to their feet shouting, "By Jove, I'm cured," and who was promptly paid in coins or gin afterward. The audience would gasp, the doctor would smile, bottles would fly off the wagon like holy relics. What was inside those bottles? That depended on how charitable you felt toward chemistry. Common ingredients included alcohol, opium, laudanum, chloroform, turpentine, ammonia, and sometimes mercury, often all at once. To the Victorians that wasn't suspicious, it was potent. Anything that burned on the way down was clearly killing something harmful. "If it makes your eyes water," Quack said, "imagine what it's doing to the disease." Indeed, it often killed both. Some formulas were so aggressively alcoholic they could double as lamp fuel. Others relied on sugar, molasses, or syrup to make the bitterness palatable. The famous cough elixirs of the day promised relief from winter's most persistent annoyance, usually by putting the patient into a mild coma. Ads for Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops assured customers of instant restoration of the lungs. They neglected to mention that each dose contained enough opium to tranquilize a horse. Then there were hair restorers, vital for the gentleman who feared that frostbite of the scalp might be mistaken for baldness. Rowland's Macassar oil promised to invigorate the follicles, and posters plastered across London showed models with glossy manes cascading like divine punishment. The product worked, if your goal was to glue dust to your head and ruin your pillowcases forever. The quacks didn't limit themselves to the sick, they targeted everyone. For women, there were complexion waters, female nervous tonics, and the ever-popular De Larkin's liquid Life for Ladies, which claimed to restore colour, joy, and possibly one's will to live, though mostly it restored inebriation. For men, there were stamina syrups, vital force elixirs, and patent magnetic pills for invincible virility. Nothing quite said Victorian masculinity like drinking magnetised mercury for courage. And naturally, there were frostbite-specific cures. Dr. Bellamy's Arctic balm claimed to restore the circulation of the extremities. The fine print might have read, by setting them on fire. Sir Percival's snow cream promised to prevent loss of limbs due to severe cold, which was optimistic considering it was mostly lard and peppermint oil. But customers didn't read ingredients, they read adjectives. Invigorating, restorative, marvellous. The Victorians loved adjectives almost as much as they loved nearly dying. Advertising was the true genius of the trade. Newspapers were filled with full-page testimonials from satisfied patients whose names were conveniently untraceable. Street posters depicted before and after illustrations, the before always a grey-faced skeleton, the after a man glowing like he'd swallowed the sun. Quacks borrowed the language of religion, promising salvation in fluid form. One bottle resurrects the weary. In a society that had made suffering respectable, their message was intoxicating, literally and figuratively. And they were everywhere. Travelling quacks toured the countryside in winter wagons. City streets hosted permanent fixtures, chemists who sold both real medicine and medicinal tonics that suspiciously resembled gin. Some even held public demonstrations, applying their balms to frostbitten animals or elderly volunteers who somehow leapt with vigour, again thanks to the secret ingredient 90% alcohol. The middle class, ever anxious to seem educated yet thrifty, fell hardest for the quack's charm. Doctors were expensive, quacks were entertaining. You could buy a miracle cure for a fraction of the price and receive as a bonus a rousing performance. For the poor the appeal was simpler, false hope was still hope, and even a fake tonic was warmer than despair. Of course the establishment medical community hated them. Journals labelled quacks as a pestilence of commerce. Yet many doctors quietly envied their success. After all, the quacks had what respectable physicians often lacked: charisma, accessibility, and immediate results, even if the result was oblivion. And while medical reformers eventually pushed for regulation, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 began limiting poison sales. Quackery adapted faster than legislation could keep up. They simply changed their slogans from "cures all" to "relieves many," and business boomed again. By century's end, quack medicine had become an art form, half theatre, half chemistry, entirely Victorian. The empire of elixirs reached its golden age in the newspapers, where every ailment had its own miracle. Headaches, weak hearts, gout and frostbite, all solvable conveniently in a bottle near you. And perhaps that's the most revealing part. For all their nonsense, quack doctors understood something real. People didn't just want medicine, they wanted belief. They wanted someone to look them in the eye, promise it would be all right, and hand them something that at least tasted like hope. It didn't matter if that hope came with a side of mercury. The good news, the elixir cured your cough. The bad news, you can now taste colours and forgot your own name. By the mid-19th century, the true wonder drug of Victorian Britain wasn't penicillin, quinine, or even whiskey. It was opium. This poppy-born miracle could soothe coughs, calm infants, cure insomnia, and erase your will to live, all in one elegant spoonful. It was medicine, entertainment, and social equaliser. From dock workers to duchesses, everyone was one dose away from a blissful, vaguely hallucinogenic detachment from reality. The only thing more addictive than opium itself was the Victorian enthusiasm for prescribing it. To understand how deep the obsession ran, you must first grasp the sheer scope of its presence. Opium wasn't a rare, shady substance whispered about in dark alleys. It was the household staple next to sugar and tea. Apothecaries sold it freely, grocers stocked it casually, and mothers administered it cheerfully. The shelves of every respectable chemist gleamed with ornate bottles labelled "Tincture of Opium," "Godfrey's Cordial," and Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Even the names sounded gentle, like a lullaby with side effects. The secret to its success was simple. Opium worked, or at least it felt like it worked. Got a cough? The opium syrup suppressed it. Suffering pain? It numbed it. Can't sleep? It knocked you out faster than a Dickens monologue. Grieving a dead relative? Opium made sure you didn't care quite as much. It was the one medicine that didn't discriminate between emotional and physical ailments, because after a few drops you couldn't tell them apart. Every ailment had its own poppy-flavoured remedy. For winter colds there was paregoric, a sweetened tincture given liberally to adults and children alike. For chronic coughs, laudanum, the aristocrat of opium derivatives, dark, syrupy, and heavily romanticised by poets who confused addiction for inspiration. The label instructions were often charmingly vague. Take as needed. Victorians took that literally. Doctors adored it. After all, it made patients stop complaining. What better metric for medical success? A physician could prescribe laudanum and leave, confident that whether the patient recovered or expired, they'd do so quietly. And for the self-medicating public, opium was liberation in liquid form. No more waiting for the doctor to arrive in his carriage. Relief was just a teaspoon away. But the drug's popularity went beyond practicality. It became cultural. Writers swore by it. Thomas de Quincey turned his addiction into literature with Confessions of an English Opium Eater, transforming personal ruin into bestseller material. Coleridge dreamed up Kubla Khan in an opium haze, proving that substance abuse could occasionally produce rhyming couplets. Artists, philosophers, and middle-aged hypochondriacs all dipped their spoons in the same dark syrup, convinced that a little chemical transcendence was simply good taste. It wasn't just the intellectual elite, though. The working class adored opium for entirely different reasons. It was cheap, available, and oblivion in a bottle. Labourers used it to dull chronic pain from industrial injuries. Mothers gave it to babies to stop crying while they worked. Entire neighbourhoods drifted through the fog of sedation. In Manchester and London, the phrase quiet child sometimes just meant slightly dozed. The results were predictably tragic. Infant deaths labelled natural causes were often quietly attributed to one spoonful too many. By the 1860s, reformers began noticing that half the country seemed unusually peaceful and not in a good way. The Lancet published editorials warning of the national opium habit. Clergymen thundered from pulpits about moral decline through narcotic indulgence, but these warnings had little effect, partly because the moralisers were often quietly sipping the same stuff. Nothing united Victorian society quite like a gentle haze of chemically induced hypocrisy. The advertising, meanwhile, was unstoppable. Posters promised instant relief for winter's torments and a comfort for the aged and the young. They rarely mentioned that comfort was quickly followed by dependency. Some tonics were even marketed as child-safe, their labels adorned with cherubs, a hauntingly ironic touch, considering the mortality statistics. In wealthy homes, opium became almost a fashion statement. Ladies took drops for nerves, headaches, and inconvenient emotions, and used it for intellectual focus, though many simply spent afternoons staring dreamily into fireplaces. Guests were sometimes offered laudanum after dinner, in the same manner one might serve dessert wine. It was perfectly respectable to be mildly narcotized, provided you did it in fine company and didn't drool on the upholstery. Of course, side effects abounded. Long-term users developed ghostly pallor, sunken eyes, and a charming inability to function before noon. Withdrawal was poorly understood. Sufferers were said to have nervous temperament or constitutional fatigue. Few realised they were addicted because addiction, as a concept, didn't yet exist. You weren't hooked, you were delicately dependent. And then there were the opium dens, the shadowy flip side of the empire's love affair with the poppy. Imported from China and sensationalised in the British press, these smoky rooms became the bogeymen of Victorian morality. Middle-class readers thrilled and shuddered at stories of sailors and clerks lying blissfully insensible in Eastern-styled opium houses. In truth, most of London's opium users never left home. Their dens were their parlours. The exotic horror was a smokescreen, literally, for a domestic addiction epidemic politely ignored by society. It took decades for science to catch up with reality. As the 19th century waned, new laws slowly restricted opium's sale, though not before generations had built their nervous systems out of it. By then, the British Empire was already exporting the habit abroad, most infamously through the Opium Wars, where addiction became foreign policy. Nothing quite says civilization like waging war to protect your right to sell narcotics. Still, in the hearts and bloodstreams of Victorians, opium retained its halo. It represented comfort in a world of cold pain and uncertainty. It numbed not just nerves, but the chaos of progress itself. A little sip, a deep sigh, and suddenly the soot, the fog, and the frost didn't seem quite so terrible. In the end, opium wasn't just a drug. It was the perfect metaphor for the age, soothing, dangerous, and beautifully delusional. The good news, you stop coughing. The bad news, you've started seeing colours that don't exist. For most of the 19th century, Victorian medicine operated on one unshakable assumption. If you were sick, it was either your fault or God's lesson plan. Doctors had theories, priests had sermons, and neither involved anything smaller than a teaspoon. Then, near the end of the century, something revolutionary and mildly insulting happened. Scientists began suggesting that the real villains weren't sinners or bad smells, but tiny invisible creatures. This idea was so audacious it bordered on rude. The germ theory of disease didn't just change medicine, it detonated it. Before this, doctors had been confidently blaming miasmas, bad humours, night air, and occasionally astrology. Illness was moral, not microbial. If you caught cholera, society assumed you'd either been hanging around the wrong neighbourhood or harbouring suspicious moral laxity. The rich, safely uphill and upwind, congratulated themselves on their virtue, while the poor died of what we now call plumbing problems. But the late Victorians were living in an age of invention, telegraphs, trains, photography, so the notion that something unseen might exist didn't sound as absurd as it once did. Enter a new breed of doctor-scientist, men with microscopes, questionable facial hair, and a burning desire to prove that filth was more than a moral metaphor. Across the channel, a Frenchman named Louis Pasteur was boiling things, milk, broth, his colleagues' patients, and discovering that heat killed the mysterious agents of decay. Meanwhile, in Germany, Robert Koch was busy infecting everything that moved and taking notes. These men did the unthinkable. They made invisible death visible. Under their lenses, microbes appeared like microscopic chaos, tiny assassins swimming merrily through bodily fluids. For the first time, doctors could actually see the enemy. It was both thrilling and deeply unsettling, especially for those who'd built entire careers on blaming bad smells. When the news reached Britain, the medical establishment reacted the way any proud institution does when proven wrong: denial first, then panic. Older doctors scoffed. Invisible creatures? Nonsense, they said, while washing their surgical instruments in yesterday's soup water. One London physician famously declared that germs were continental fancy, unfit for the English temperament. Another insisted that disease was not imported by microbes, but by foreigners, which was a very British compromise between ignorance and nationalism. Still, the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Experiments demonstrated that sterilising instruments reduced infection. Hospitals that cleaned their wards saw survival rates skyrocket. The legendary surgeon Joseph Lister became Britain's microbial messiah, championing antiseptics and carbolic acid. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad, spraying chemicals around like an over-enthusiastic janitor. But when his patients stopped dying quite so frequently, they began paying attention. "Cleanliness saves lives," Lister declared, to which the nation collectively replied, "Who could have predicted?" The transformation was slow but seismic. For centuries, surgeons had worked in blood-stained coats, not as an oversight but as a badge of honour. The more stains, the more experience. Now, Lister demanded cleanliness. Instruments were boiled, hands were scrubbed, and surgical theatres began to look less like butcher shops and more like laboratories. Medical students complained that hospitals no longer smelled of the profession. Patients, meanwhile, began surviving. Everyone won except the laundry staff. Beyond hospitals, germ theory upended daily life. Suddenly, everything seemed dangerous. Doorknob, drinking water, children. Cleanliness, once a sign of snobbery, became a matter of survival. Soap manufacturers rejoiced. Housewives armed with new scientific authority began waging war on invisible filth. Kitchen hygiene turned militant. Mothers boiled toys, sterilised milk bottles, and eyed the family cat suspiciously. Anxious Victorians developed a new national sport, disinfecting everything. The government got involved too, reluctantly at first, then with gusto once they realised how many diseases were caused by the same thing. People being too close to their own waste. Sewer systems expanded, water filtration improved, and public health finally meant more than moral lectures. Joseph Bazalgette's London sewers, massive, brick-lined and gloriously overbuilt, became monuments to germ theory in action. Cholera outbreaks, once routine, declined dramatically. The Empire discovered that prevention worked better than prayer. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The idea that disease came from filth, not sin, felt morally inconvenient. Preachers lamented that germs had stolen God's thunder. If cleanliness is next to godliness, one vicar sighed, then science is getting uncomfortably close to the pulpit. But there was no stopping it. The microscope had dethroned divine punishment, and the world would never look the same again. Even the language of health changed. Bad air became bacteria. Unwholesome vapours became pathogens. Where once the solution had been prayer or perfume, it was now sanitation and soap. The Victorians didn't stop the moralising, idiots. They simply redirected their guilt. Filthy streets became symbols of civic shame, and personal hygiene became a matter of moral pride. Germ theory didn't end judgment, it just modernised it. Yet for all its science, the shift was also profoundly emotional. Imagine a society realising almost overnight that their world teemed with unseen life. Not the divine, but the disgusting. Water, once refreshing, now harboured invisible assassins. Breadcrumbs could sprout colonies. Kisses exchanged entire ecosystems. We are surrounded by life we cannot see, one pamphlet warned, and it is out to kill us. Victorian paranoia, already an art form, reached new heights. But knowledge brought power. Hospitals became cleaner, cities grew safer, and doctors, once glorified guessers, became something resembling professionals. By the dawn of the 20th century, the war against invisible monsters had begun in earnest, and for the first time in history, humanity had a fighting chance. Of course, the irony was delicious. The same society that once believed illness was a punishment from God now learned it could be prevented with soap and boiling water. Entire centuries of sermons, undone by a bar of carbolic soap. Turns out, science said smugly, it wasn't sin, it was slime. The good news, you're not cursed by God. The bad news, you're infested by microbes with worse manners. By the late Victorian era, the empire was positively steaming, and not just from the Industrial Revolution. Factories roared, locomotives puffed, and kettles sang. Somewhere along the way, the Victorians decided that if steam could power engines, perhaps it could also power health. Thus was born the steam craze, an era where medicine, technology, and sweat formed a therapeutic triangle of confusion. To Victorians, steam was the visible proof of progress. It was warm, dramatic, and, crucially, expensive to produce, which made it immediately respectable. Doctors began prescribing steam baths, steam inhalations, and even steam-powered contraptions for everything from bronchitis to heartbreak. Inhale progress, one advertisement proclaimed, and exhale infirmity. It was the first self-care movement that required plumbing. The fascination began innocently enough. Physicians noticed that people felt better after a hot bath, or a few minutes in a warm, moist environment. Breathing steam seemed to ease coughs and open airways, especially after a winter spent inhaling coal smoke and regret. But as with all Victorian ideas, moderation was quickly declared unambitious. If a little steam helped, A room full of it must perform miracles. Soon Britain was covered in a fine fog of optimism. Steam inhalation became the home remedy of choice. A teapot, a towel, and a sense of purpose were the only tools required. Patients leaned over steaming water infused with camphor, eucalyptus, or whatever herb the nearest apothecary swore by that week. It clears the lungs, people declared proudly, though it also cleared sinuses, makeup, and occasionally consciousness. Families gathered around bowls of steaming water like it was a religious ceremony. You weren't just fighting a cold, you were engaging in moral purification by moisture. Then came the steam baths, temples of heat that promised to purge illness through perspiration. Spas sprang up across the country, elaborate marble-tiled institutions where clients could sweat away vice. Steam was touted as a democratic cure, equally effective for coughs, colds, gout, melancholy, and general failure at life. Doctors spoke of opening the pores as if humanity's salvation lay in its sweat glands. Patients emerged pink, dizzy, and vaguely enlightened. Some establishments took the idea to architectural extremes. The Turkish bath craze hit London like a wave of damp enthusiasm. Inspired by Ottoman hammams, these bathhouses combined exotic flair with rigid British scheduling. Patrons progressed through rooms of escalating heat until they resembled boiled lobsters, then were doused with cold water and declared revitalised. The experience was both agonising and addictive. The motto was simple: if you're not fainting, you're not healing. Not to be outdone, inventors introduced personal steam cabinets, individual sweat boxes resembling upright coffins with head holes. The patient sat inside while a hidden kettle blasted steam upward, transforming them into human dumplings. Queen Victoria herself reportedly owned one, ensuring that even monarchy could be gently poached for health. Advertisements promised that 10 minutes in a vaporous cocoon could melt cleanse blood war, and make the body as pure as an angel's sea. The reality was closer to a boiled egg with anxiety. The upper classes turned steam therapy into a social affair. Steam rooms in gentlemen's clubs became the Victorian equivalent of networking events, men sweating in unison while discussing empire and gout. A fine perspiration, old boy, was considered a compliment. Ladies' versions featured scented vapours and fainting couches for post-steam recovery. A woman's delicate constitution, doctors assured, required gentler humidity. In other words, fewer degrees, more lavender. For those who couldn't afford luxury spas, travelling steam doctors brought the miracle to the masses. These entrepreneurs toured rural areas with portable boilers strapped to wagons, offering treatments for a modest fee or a small explosion risk. Patients were seated in tents filled with vapour and are left to purify for 20 minutes. If they emerged conscious, it was deemed a success. The only safety regulation was prayer. Medical journals split into two camps. Some physicians praised steam as nature's gentle stimulant. Others warned that overheating the body weakened the nerves. Victorian shorthand for it made you weird. Still, the fad persisted. Doctors prescribed steam inhalations for asthma, facial vapours for acne, and steam tonics for general unhappiness. Steam was everywhere, in hospitals, homes, and even beauty salons, where women willingly roasted themselves for the promise of radiant skin. The language around steam therapy bordered on spiritual. Pamphlets spoke of releasing impurities, awakening the inner warmth, and equalizing the humours through vapour. Science and mysticism held hands in a sweaty alliance. Steam wasn't just physical, it were moral. To sweat was to prove you were actively resisting illness. Clean pores meant a clean conscience. Victorian doctors managed to turn basic thermoregulation into an act of virtue. Naturally, quacks joined the movement. Miracle devices flooded the market. The Hydrovaporizer 2000, the electric steamer of life, Dr. Paulson's pneumatic purifier. Each one promised to harness scientific steam to heal everything from hysteria to halitosis. Some combined steam with electricity, producing what witnesses described as a faint burning sensation and a strong desire to leave. Still, sales soared. As with all good fads, the steam craze eventually reached its logical conclusion: absurdity. Steam bread ovens were marketed as digestive rejuvenators. Steam corsets promised circulatory enhancement. One enterprising inventor even proposed steam dentistry, a system that used vapor jets to soften the gums for painless extraction. Patients preferred pain, yet beneath the comedy, the craze hinted at something profound. The Victorian yearning for cleanliness, control, and visible health. Steam symbolized purity. Heat made filth flee. It was the physical embodiment of progress. Man mastering nature, one sweaty minute at a time. And in a world still reeling from disease and dirt, that illusion of mastery was powerful indeed. By the early 20th century, steam therapy evolved into modern saunas and inhalers, less dangerous, equally steamy. But the Victorian legacy lingered. Even today we still steam our faces and sweat out toxins, echoing the ghostly optimism of those who believed that if you could just perspire long enough, life itself might start behaving. The good news, the steam cleared your lungs. The bad news, it also cooked your eyebrows. If the Victorian era had a motto, it might have been, why not make it hurt a little? From mustard plasters to moral guilt, no cure was considered complete unless it made the patient question their life choices. So it's no surprise that when hydrotherapy, or the water cure, swept across 19th century Britain, it came not in the form of cosy hot tubs, but as a national craze for being violently, enthusiastically dunked in ice water. The logic was simple. If warmth could heal, as the steam doctors claimed, then surely cold could cleanse. The Victorians were masters of opposites: moral heat, physical chill, so the idea that hypothermia could fix what ailed you felt entirely reasonable. The colder the water, the more virtuous the suffering. Purify the flesh, strengthen the soul, promised the pamphlets. Translation: prepare to scream. Hydrotherapy didn't begin in Britain. It splashed over from continental Europe, particularly from Germany, where a farmer-turned-healer named Vincent Priestnitz made a fortune dousing wealthy hypochondriacs in mountain water. He claimed the shock rebalanced the humours and restored vigour. His followers arrived at his spa wrapped in shawls and left wrapped in towels, gloriously blue and slightly traumatised. But they felt healthier, or at least too numb to argue. Soon, Britain caught the chill. Hydrotherapy clinics popped up across the country, sprawling institutions in rural hills, conveniently far from anywhere a sane person might escape to. The most famous, Ben Ridding Hydro in Yorkshire, became a mecca for the damply devoted. Guests paid small fortunes to be submerged, showered, sprayed, and occasionally hurled into icy pools for their own good. The rich called it taking the cure, the staff called it Tuesday. Every clinic offered a bewildering array of aquatic torments, each with its own Latin name and lofty justification. The cold plunge bath was the classic, a full-body immersion in water so frigid it could stop a sermon mid-sentence. Patients were told to stay submerged until invigorated, a term which loosely translated to on the verge of cardiac arrest. Those who survived were rewarded with blankets, dry towels, and spiritual smugness. Then came the douche bath, which had nothing to do with hygiene and everything to do with being blasted by water hoses at unpredictable angles. Attendants aimed jets at your spine, shoulders, and kidneys with military precision. The shock, they said, stimulated the nerves. In truth, it mostly stimulated the desire to flee, but Victorians endured it with grim dignity, convinced that pain meant progress. The wet sheet wrap was another favourite, the Victorian equivalent of the burrito method. Patients were wrapped tightly in sheets soaked in cold water, then layered with dry blankets until they resembled melancholic caterpillars. The idea was that the initial chill drew out toxins, while the ensuing shivering was a sign of rebirth. One enthusiastic doctor called it the embrace of health. His patients called it suffocation, with polite applause. For those who preferred a more delicate form of punishment, there was the dripping sheet, which involved standing naked while a sheet dampened with icy water was draped over you. The experience was described as bracing. Others described it as a slow-moving nightmare with linens. Hydrotherapy quickly became fashionable among the upper classes. Newspapers printed glowing accounts of dukes and duchesses who emerged from the waters renewed. Society ladies praised the cure for improving complexion and curing hysteria, though skeptics suggested that shrieking in cold water might simply have replaced the symptom with a louder one. Aristocrats treated it like a status symbol. You haven't truly lived until you've nearly drowned under medical supervision. Doctors, meanwhile, adopted the craze with clinical flair. Hydrotherapists wrote thick manuals filled with phrases like capillary excitement and aqueous stimulation. Every illness, from gout to grief, could apparently be washed away. Feeling depressed? Ice bath, constipated. Ice bath, unable to sleep. Ice bath, and possibly prayer. The Victorians didn't believe in half measures, only half-temperature ones. And yet beneath the absurdity, hydrotherapy did hold some truth. Exercise, fresh air and clean water did improve health, especially in an era when urban life was a cocktail of filth and fumes. Many clinics encouraged walking, light diets, and abstinence from alcohol, a shock greater than the water itself. For some patients, the routine alone, early mornings, structured meals, enforced baths, restored a sense of order and vitality. But that didn't stop others from overdoing it. Some hydrotherapists were little more than enthusiastic sadists. Reports emerged of patients kept in freezing compresses for hours, of fainting fits mistaken for progress, and of people leaving the cure in worse shape than when they arrived. In one case, a man treated for nervous exhaustion was plunged into a stream daily until his nerves were exhausted permanently. He died invigorated, the obituary might as well have said. Still, the fashion held. By the 1870s, no health spa was complete without its assortment of marble baths, pressure hoses, and optimistic Latin signage. Even city homes installed water closets and baths for healthful immersion, marking the beginning of modern hygiene culture. What began as pseudo-medicine ended accidentally in plumbing reform. If hydrotherapy didn't always cure your illness, it at least made sure you smelled respectable at the funeral. By the turn of the century, hydrotherapy evolved into gentler spa culture. The hot springs, mineral baths, and saunas we recognise today. But the Victorian version remains a masterpiece of misplaced enthusiasm, a movement that equated suffering with salvation and frostbite with moral growth. In the end, hydrotherapy was the perfect reflection of the age, industrial, disciplined, self-punishing, and endlessly optimistic that progress, like good health, could be achieved through sheer discomfort. The good news? The water's invigorating. The bad news? You can't feel your skeleton. If there's one organ that truly embodied the Victorian condition, overworked, overanalyzed, and constantly offended, it was the nose. In an age of coal smoke, bad drains, and questionable hygiene, the Victorian nose was both battleground and barometer. It sniffed out disease, judged morality by scent, and politely tried not to breathe too deeply in public. But most of all, it became the centerpiece of an entire subculture of snot-based science, etiquette, and innovation. To the Victorians, the nose wasn't just for breathing, it was a moral instrument. A refined nose indicated a refined soul. A stuffy nose suggested poor character or weak constitution. And a runny one? Well, that was practically a confession of sin. The well-bred classes prided themselves on controlled respiration, elegant sniffing, and discreet sneezing. One must never explode in company, etiquette manuals warn, only evaporate. In polite circles, sneezing too loudly could demote your social standing faster than bankruptcy. Of course, this was a society drowning in smells. London's air was a cocktail of coal, soot, manure, sweat, and decomposing ambition. The nose, constantly assaulted, became both victim and diagnostic tool. Doctors believed that the nose warned of humoral imbalance, that certain scents could either heal or harm. Thus, the Victorian obsession with aromatherapy before it was cool, menthol, camphor, lavender and vinegar, were all considered medicinal aromas. To refresh the nose was to purify the soul. Enter the age of nasal remedies, a booming business where science, superstition and sinus misery collided. Apothecaries stocked powders, balms and inhalers, promising to unclog, invigorate and occasionally obliterate your nasal passages. Menthol crystals were the superstar of the era. One whiff, and your sinuses felt like they'd been slapped by the North Sea. Doctors prescribed menthol for colds, headaches and even depression. A bracing shock to the brain, one physician called it, as if numbness equalled enlightenment. Then there was camphor, the Victorian cure-all that could repel both illness and friends. People carried camphor-soaked handkerchiefs and pressed them to their faces in public, hoping to ward off miasmas, those invisible clouds of bad air blamed for every disease from cholera to the common cold. The result was an entire society smelling faintly of mothballs and denial. In theatres, the combined scent of camphor, perfume and perspiration created an atmosphere so potent it could probably be bottled as Ode to Victorian Panic. But not all nasal pursuits were medicinal. Some were pure pleasure, or at least what passed for it. The upper classes adored snuff, that powdered tobacco delicacy meant to be sniffed, not smoked. Taking snuff was an art form. The graceful pinch, the delicate inhale, the genteel sneeze suppressed at the last moment. It was tobacco as performance, and it came with all the accessories of a small religion. Snuff boxes, often encrusted with jewels or moral superiority, were prized possessions. A gentleman's social status could practically be measured by how ornate his snuff box was, and how much of his nose lining remained intact. Of course, too much snuff led to the dreaded condition of nasal decay, a problem discreetly ignored in polite society. Doctors described it as erosion of the septum due to excess stimulation. Translation: you've inhaled yourself into a medical curiosity. But quitting wasn't easy. Snuff was socially addictive. To refuse it was to appear unmanly, unrefined, or worst of all, dull. For those not fortunate enough to afford golden snuff boxes, there was the humbler art of handkerchief medicine. Every respectable Victorian carried one, monogrammed, perfumed and weaponized with camphor or vinegar. The handkerchief served as mask, medicine and moral shield. To walk the streets without one was like walking naked through the moral fog. The poor used rags, the rich used silk squares embroidered with flowers and denial. When illness struck, people soaked their handkerchiefs in remedies and inhaled deeply, an early if inefficient version of nasal therapy. The rise of nasal hygiene also gave birth to bizarre contraptions. Inventors patented nose-cleansing syringes, nasal irrigation devices, and respirators, delicate wire masks covered with gauze designed to filter the impurities of the city. These were worn in public by the truly health-conscious, giving them the appearance of genteel bank robbers. Advertisements promised that the respirator would protect the lungs and preserve the complexion. Whether it worked or merely made one look ridiculous remains uncertain, though the Victorians never let practicality ruin a good trend. By the 1880s, the discovery of germs gave the nose new importance. Suddenly sneezing became suspicious. Doctors warned that droplets expelled in the act of sternutation, that sneezing, but more expensive, could spread disease. This led to a golden age of nasal etiquette. Manuals instructed readers to sneeze into the handkerchief, never into the air lest one pollute one's neighbours. In a single decade, sneezing transformed from a bodily reflex into a moral crisis. Yet despite the warnings, the Victorians couldn't resist sticking things up their noses. Remedies included inhaling the fumes of burning herbs, sniffing ammonia to invigorate the system, and even dabbing the nostrils with carbolic acid, which indeed killed germs along with your sense of smell. One daring inventor introduced the menthol cigarette, marketed as a soothing smoke for the sinuses. Early adopters reported instant relief followed by long-term coughing. The era's motto might as well have been, "If it burns, it's working." Snot itself, believe it or not, was treated as diagnostic material. Medical journals contained essays with titles like "The Character of Nasal Discharge in Winter Agues" and "Observations upon Mucus Secretions in the Industrious Classes." Doctors actually examine mucus colour and consistency with scientific reverence. Yellow is indicative of bile, clear, a sign of weak vitality, and green, evidence of robust purgation. No one was safe from scrutiny, not even their sinuses, but beneath the absurd rituals and nasal snobbery was something undeniably human, the desperate attempt to breathe in an age that often felt suffocating. The Victorians lived in cities where the air itself was a pollutant, where fresh was a luxury and clean an illusion. They turned their noses into instruments of survival, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes ingenious, always determined. By century's end, the age of steam and soot gave way to an age of sterility and scented oils. Menthol and eucalyptus outlived empire, handkerchiefs gave way to tissues, and somewhere the spirit of the Victorian nose sighed with relief. The good news, you can breathe again. The bad news, you've just inhaled half the pharmacy. Of all the diseases that haunted the Victorian age, none captured the imagination quite like tuberculosis, or, as they preferred to call it, consumption. It wasn't just an illness, it was a full-blown aesthetic. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, delicate cough. Consumption turned suffering into art. You didn't simply have tuberculosis, you embodied it, preferably while reclining near a window with a wistful gaze, and just enough strength left to recite poetry before expiring gracefully. The name consumption said it all. The disease appeared to consume its victims slowly, body first, then spirit. It wasted them elegantly, leaving behind emaciated figures that Victorians bizarrely found beautiful. Writers described consumptives as ethereal, angelic, and transcendent, as if tuberculosis were heaven's modelling agency. Artists painted them in soft light, poets wrote odes to their fragility, and audiences sighed over heroines who coughed themselves into legend. The appeal wasn't entirely aesthetic, it was also symbolic. In a society obsessed with morality and restraint, consumption looked like a spiritual illness, a poetic undoing of the sensitive soul. She died of feeling too deeply, they'd whisper, as if empathy were contagious. The disease seemed to strike the pure and the passionate, the kind of people who read Byron by candlelight or played Chopin in minor keys. If you had tuberculosis, it meant you were either tragic, talented, or both. Of course, the reality was far less graceful. Tuberculosis was a bacterial infection that attacked the lungs, often spreading to the bones, brain, and kidneys. Symptoms included endless coughing, fever, night sweats, and wasting away until one resembled a haunted violin. But the Victorians, ever romantic, edited out the unpleasant parts. A little blood on a handkerchief, tragic beauty, endless hacking, passionate fragility. Dying at 23, proof that you had truly lived. The disease's glamour was fueled by its victims. The romantic poets were poster children for consumption chic. Keats, Shelley, and Byron all coughed their way into immortality. In the Victorian imagination, to die of tuberculosis was to ascend artistically. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms across London, young ladies practiced looking faint and wistful. Tuberculosis cosplay without the germs. Rouge was out, pallor was in. Pale skin, once a sign of anemia, became the ultimate beauty ideal. Fashionable women dusted their faces with rice powder until they resembled ghosts who had good taste in jewellery. Even men weren't immune to the aesthetic appeal. The consumptive gentleman, lean, pale, and tragically weary, became a romantic archetype. He might be too frail to duel, but strong enough to pen a love letter in trembling ink. It was the age's version of tortured masculinity, the body decaying while the soul burned brighter. The candle that burns twice as bright, Victorians said dreamily, burns half as long. They neglected to mention that the candle also coughed up blood. Meanwhile, actual patients filled sanatoriums, less poetic, more phlegmatic institutions where people went to take the air. Before germ theory clarified anything, doctors prescribed sunlight, mountain air, and moral rest. Wealthy consumptives retreated to spa towns or the Alps, believing altitude could scare off death. Patients were tucked into blankets on balconies, coughing rhythmically into the wind while nurses took notes. For the poor, there were no picturesque mountains, just workhouses and shared hospital beds. Their coughs were less romantic sighs and more background noise. Still, the mythology endured. Literature fed it shamelessly. In La Dame aux Camélias, the heroine Camille coughs her way into her lover's eternal devotion, and several profitable stage adaptations. La Traviata transformed her story into opera, with tuberculosis as both villain and muse. On stage, death was elegant. Off stage, it was epidemic. By mid-century, tuberculosis killed 1 in 4 people in Britain. The romance was literally contagious. Doctors tried everything: bleeding, blistering, cod liver oil, inhaled creosote, even pulled arsenic cigarettes. For soothing the lungs, they promised. Though not for long, none of it worked. It wasn't until Robert Koch identified the Mycobacterium tuberculosis in 1882 that the medical facade began to crack. The disease was no longer mystical, just microbial. This revelation was devastating to the Victorian sense of drama. How could something so poetic be caused by bacteria? The muse had been downgraded to a germ. Still, the cultural inertia of the beautiful consumptive lingered. Even as science advanced, fashion clung to fragility. Thinness became aspirational. Pale skin remained chic. In a strange twist, tuberculosis helped invent the modern beauty standard. Slim, soft-spoken, and slightly miserable. Advertisements for tonics for delicate women exploited the look without mentioning the coffin that came with it. By the end of the century, sanatoriums evolved into high-end retreats, where patients were encouraged to rest, eat heartily, and sunbathe, activities once thought scandalously indulgent. Doctors replaced moral lectures with milk and naps. Fresh air and good food, they said, are the cure, which ironically worked because malnutrition and poor ventilation had fueled the epidemic all along. The tragedy turned out to be preventable, not poetic, and yet tuberculosis refused to lose its mystique. Even as death rates declined, its imagery persisted in art, fashion, and language. The pale heroine, the gentle cough, the doomed romance, they became templates for 1,000 novels and melodramas. The Victorians, unable to let go of their favourite tragedy, immortalised it in culture long after the bacteria had been identified and controlled. Perhaps that was the real infection, not the germ, but the aesthetic of suffering. The Victorians believed beauty was born of pain, that frailty signified refinement, that dying prettily was almost a moral act. In their world, tuberculosis wasn't just an illness. It was a lifestyle choice endorsed by poetry, tragedy, and bad science. The good news? You look ethereal. The bad news? That's because you're halfway to the afterlife. Victorian childhood was not for the faint of heart or lungs. If you made it to adulthood with all 10 fingers and a working pair of nostrils, you had essentially won a survival lottery. Winter was especially brutal, transforming every home, school, and street into a battlefield between frailty and frost. In an era that believed hardship builds character, children were expected to build plenty, preferably before breakfast. Let's begin with schoolhouses, those drafty monuments to moral instruction. Heating was often a theoretical concept. A single coal stove stood in the centre of the room, glowing faintly like a distant star, while 40 children froze at the periphery. Teachers, armed with rulers and optimism, assured them that cold air toughened the constitution. It also froze the ink, cracked the desks, and occasionally glued the students to their benches via frozen trousers. Lessons in arithmetic often ended when fingers became too numb to count. Coughing was the schoolroom soundtrack. Pupils hacked in rhythm like a tubercular orchestra, yet attendance remained compulsory. A little chill never hurt anyone, said adults who had never attended class with frost forming on the windows and their breath visible mid-grammar exercise. The idea of heating was dismissed as coddling. After all, if children could endure cold now, they'd be prepared for the chill of adulthood, or more accurately, the workhouse. Outside of school, the Victorian playground was no refuge. Urban children played in alleys coated in soot and ice, the air thick with coal dust. Snow, when it fell, didn't stay white for long. It turned elegant industrial grey within hours. Snowball fights carried genuine risk. If the snow contained a bit of soot or gravel, all the better for building character. The wealthier children had governesses to supervise their winter exercise, ensuring they caught just enough chill to stay pale and delicate, but not so much as to die of it. For working-class children, winter was not about play, it was about survival and labour. Boys hawked newspapers with chapped lips and blue fingers, while girls worked in textile mills where steam mixed with cold drafts to create climates ideal for respiratory collapse. Child labour laws existed on paper, but the frost didn't read legislation. By dawn, children trudged to factories in layers of patched clothing so stiff from dampness they could stand up on their own. At home, mothers waged their own small wars against the cold and its consequences. When doctors were unaffordable or unhelpful, there remained the sacred arsenal of home remedies: mustard poultices, goose grease, hot bricks wrapped in flannel, and anything that steamed or smoked. Mustard poultices were the era's go-to cure for everything from chest colds to sore throats. The process was simple: smear mustard paste on cloth, apply it to the patient's chest, and wait until they screamed. Pain was proof it was working. It draws out the illness, mothers said. In reality, it drew out skin. Children also endured vinegar socks to restore circulation, onion poultices to draw the fever, and camphor rubbed on the chest until it glowed like a hazard light. Some households used warmed salt wrapped in linen. Others swore by goose fat spread liberally and topped with brown paper, essentially turning the child into a sandwich of desperation. At least it's natural, they'd say proudly, as though the laws of biology should be flattered. Meanwhile, the dietary defences against winter illness were equally grim. Rich families feasted on roasts and puddings to build the blood, while poorer ones subsisted on bread crusts and tea. A doctor might recommend cod liver oil, thick, fishy and traumatic, to fortify the constitution. It was as close as Victorian medicine got to punishment disguised as nutrition. Children held their noses and gulped, their reward being the certainty that at least they wouldn't have to eat again for several hours. Disease was a seasonal visitor that never missed an invitation. Scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, all made their rounds each winter like recurring guests at a ghastly dinner party. Entire families went down in waves. Catching everything was considered part of growing up. Surviving it all was proof of worthiness. If a child died, it was said they were too pure for this world. If they lived, they were blessed with strong lungs. It was less diagnosis, more gambling. Upper-class families with better access to country air and actual fires fared somewhat better, though their doctors often prescribed frost exposure as a tonic. Children must breathe the cold to grow hearty, they insisted. So little Edward or Beatrice was bundled into a perambulator and wheeled into the wintry garden to nap in nature. The result? Babies who napped like statues. Victorian parenting often blurred the line between bravery and negligence. Even toys reflected the chill. Tin soldiers stood stiff and metallic, boo-boo dolls' porcelain faces looked appropriately consumptive, and rocking horses bore the same blank expression as children forced to play outdoors for health. Holiday gifts included wool mittens knitted by grandmothers whose hands shook too much to finish them before February. Warmth, like affection, was implied rather than provided, and yet somehow the majority endured. The survivors of Victorian winters grew up with iron lungs and impressive cynicism. They learned early that endurance was currency, that a runny nose wasn't cause for complaint but a sign of participation. Childhood immunity, in this sense, wasn't biological, it was existential. You didn't just survive disease, you survived the cure, the cold, and the moral lecture that came afterward. By the dawn of the 20th century, public health reforms and heating improvements slowly thawed the nation's children. But the ghost of that era lingered. The belief that suffering built strength, that comfort softened morals, and that a healthy child was one who could sneeze, cough, and still say, "Thank you, ma'am." The good news, you survived the winter. The bad news, that means you're now considered fit for factory work. Few centuries worshipped heroism quite like the Victorians, and few produced as many frozen corpses in the pursuit of it. From the snow-choked barracks of Crimea to the drifting tombs of the Arctic, the Victorian age turned frostbite into a national pastime. The empire prided itself on endurance, discipline, and the ability to perish stylishly in temperatures that killed penguins. To suffer from cold wasn't just unfortunate, it was imperial character development. Let's begin with the soldiers, those uncomplaining, underdressed men who stood guard in sleet while officers debated the morality of mittens. The Victorian army believed warmth bred weakness. Blankets were rationed, fires discouraged, and frostbite treated like a failure of willpower. Military manuals advised vigorous movement to prevent freezing, as though a lively jig could outdance hypothermia. In the trenches of Crimea, men wrapped rags around their boots, rubbed snow on blackened fingers, and prayed their toes wouldn't mutiny before dawn. Letters home described comrades whose feet cracked like porcelain, while others had ears lost to the wind. The good news, they couldn't feel the lice anymore. The Crimean War, 1853-56, was a particularly frigid lesson in logistics gone mad. Soldiers shipped to the front arrived with polished buttons and no winter uniforms. Wool coats froze stiff, tents collapsed under snow, and medical supplies froze solid. The British Army discovered that bravery was not in fact a substitute for insulation. Thousands succumbed to frostbite, gangrene, and the cold's favourite accomplice, bureaucratic delay. When help finally arrived, it was usually in the form of Florence Nightingale, armed with blankets and disapproval. Yet the soldiers' plight paled beside the Arctic explorers, those madmen in waistcoats who sailed north seeking fame, science, and frostbite in roughly equal measure. The Victorian public adored them. Newspapers printed engravings of icebound ships and pale men nobly freezing to death in the name of cartography. To perish heroically in the Arctic was the 19th century equivalent of winning an Oscar. The most infamous case was Sir John Franklin's expedition in 1845, which sailed into the Arctic with 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, and enough canned food to feed a small nation, unfortunately sealed with lead. The men never returned. When search parties finally found traces of the crew, they discovered a scene less heroic and more horrific. Frostbitten corpses, shattered camps, and grim evidence of cannibalism. The Empire spun it as tragedy, not disaster. The explorers hadn't failed, they had died gloriously. It was the ultimate Victorian spin. Even hypothermia was a form of patriotism. Later expeditions fared little better. Captain Nares's Arctic voyage, 1875-76, saw frostbite cases so severe that fingers dropped off like buttons from a worn coat. The surgeon's report described men whose noses turned black and whose hands were as brittle as ice-glazed wood. Treatment consisted of rubbing snow on the frostbitten parts, a medical approach roughly equivalent to slapping a shark to make it leave. Still, discipline remained the order of the day. "Do not complain," officers reminded their men. "The Queen expects composure." Presumably, Her Majesty preferred her empire frozen but polite. But cold didn't just attack the body, it devoured the mind. Arctic madness, or polar melancholia, became the ghostly twin of frostbite. Men trapped for months in endless night grew paranoid, depressed, or eerily euphoric. Diaries describe officers conversing with imaginary dinner guests, sailors laughing at snowdrifts, and crewmen quietly walking into the ice to fetch a bit of air. The human brain, it turns out, doesn't thrive on salted meat and perpetual twilight. Yet the Victorians framed even this psychological breakdown as courage. They suffered nobly, reports read, as if freezing into delirium was a moral achievement. The medical remedies for frostbite were as creative as they were catastrophic. Some surgeons applied hot brandy compresses, others recommended rubbing with snow until the part resumes colour. Translation, until it falls off. Whiskey was administered liberally, less for healing than distraction. "A tot of rum for the frozen man," went the unofficial Navy motto, because if the cure didn't work, at least he'd die cheerful. And yet, there was method amid the madness. These frozen expeditions did yield discoveries, maps, scientific data, and a profound appreciation for tropical climates. They also revolutionized survival tactics, the use of animal fur, insulated boots, and portable stoves after realizing that gentlemen's wool coats were decorative, not thermal. Later explorers like Fridtjof Nansen learned to respect the cold rather than challenge it with British arrogance. But by then, dozens of crews had already tested and failed the limits of stoicism. Back home, the public devoured the stories. Illustrated newspapers turned these frostbitten tragedies into serialized epics. Paintings showed brave men staring nobly at the horizon, omitting the blackened stumps beneath their gloves. The Victorian imagination turned frostbite into martyrdom, the empire's proof that its sons would rather die upright in a snowdrift than sit comfortably by a fire. Lecturers toured cities displaying relics from lost expeditions, compasses, diaries, bits of frozen rope, relics of endurance packaged for entertainment. Audiences gasped, applauded, and then went home to tea and blankets. In truth, frostbite was the great democratizer of Victorian heroism. Whether soldier or sailor, officer or deckhand, the cold did not discriminate. It gnawed through empire, rank and reason alike. But the Victorians clung to their myth of endurance. Pain, after all, was proof of purpose. To suffer was to serve. And if one's limbs didn't make it home, one's reputation surely would. By the end of the century, better equipment, medical knowledge, and the occasional common sense began to thaw Britain's love affair with hypothermia. But the legend remained. The image of the stoic explorer, snow in his beard, diary in hand, nobly freezing for queen and country. The good news, you've made history. The bad news, parts of you are staying there permanently. Whose cities in history have managed to make air itself a weapon quite like Victorian London? To live there in winter was to breathe through a nightmare in slow motion, thick, yellow and faintly alive. The famous London fog wasn't the gentle, poetic mist of novels. It was more like inhaling the inside of a chimney. It didn't roll in. It oozed, swallowing streets, choking lamplight, and occasionally entire pedestrians. The Victorians, never ones to let reality ruin their brand, initially romanticised it. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it, and tourists came to see it, until they realised that it was trying to kill them. The city is shrouded in mystery, said guidebooks, neglecting to mention that the mystery was mostly where you just put your foot. Dickens called it a London particular, which sounded charming until you coughed one up. This wasn't ordinary fog, of course. It was the love child of weather and industry, a marriage of damp air and millions of coal fires burning day and night. Every home, factory and bakery belched smoke into the sky. Coal was the empire's lifeblood and its slow poison. Rich households used smokeless coal, but most Londoners couldn't afford such luxuries. The cheaper stuff, soft, sulphur-heavy and unrepentantly filthy, burned like sin and smelled twice as bad. When cold air trapped this smoke close to the ground, the result was the dreaded pea souper, a fog so thick you could lose sight of your own hands. The name wasn't metaphorical. The air literally glowed greenish-yellow from chemical reactions between sulphur, soot and dampness. It clung to clothing, hair and lungs with equal devotion. One journalist described it as a city inhaling its own funeral. Another simply wrote, "You taste it before you see it." The effects were immediate and grim. Visibility dropped to inches. Carriages collided, lamplighters vanished mid-route, and pedestrians stumbled into the Thames or each other. Police stations reported a surge in accidental crimes. People genuinely couldn't see who they were mugging. Even gas lamps, the pride of modern London, were rendered useless, their glow swallowed by the smog. The city turned nocturnal at noon. Then came the health toll. The infamous London cough became a badge of residency, a hacking symphony heard through tenement walls and theatre aisles. Doctors called it fog bronchitis, but most Londoners just called it winter. Soot particles coated the inside of lungs, inflaming everything they touched. The very young and the very old suffocated quietly in their beds. In bad years, mortality rates doubled, yet newspapers described it as unfortunate weather. One of the worst episodes came in December 1873, when a dense fog settled over the city for days. Traffic halted, businesses closed, and an estimated 700 people died in a single week. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors compared the air to inhaling a chimney sweep. Yet as always, the Victorians endured, coughing politely into handkerchiefs scented with vinegar or camphor, convinced they were purifying the lungs while merely marinating them. The city's poor suffered most, of course. The East End, where families huddled over cheap coal stoves in airless rooms, became a fog within a fog. Children played in streets where daylight never reached. The soot that filled their lungs also settled into their bread, their blankets, and their skin. Clean became a relative concept, meaning visible from 2 feet away. In contrast, the wealthy fled to country estates during the worst months, declaring from afar that the smog gave London its character. The scientific community, once convinced that bad smells were the true culprits of disease, struggled to grasp that the killer was invisible, except when it wasn't. Doctors debated whether fog poisoned the lungs or simply weakened the spirit. Newspapers printed recipes for fog filters, cloth masks soaked in vinegar, early prototypes of gas masks that made you smell like salad dressing. Meanwhile, inventors seized the opportunity. One genius advertised the respiratory protector, a wire contraption filled with wool that strapped over the nose like a hamster cage. Another promoted indoor ozone generators, essentially sparks in boxes that filled rooms with the soothing smell of electrocution. People bought them anyway. In a society where invisible death wafted through the streets, any gadget that promised breathable optimism sold out fast. The irony was that London had done this to itself, one chimney at a time. The Industrial Revolution had filled its belly and blackened its skier. Factories burned around the clock, railways spat soot across the skyline. The same coal that powered progress also ensured that progress couldn't be seen. Foreign visitors described the city as an underworld of vapour. One American tourist wrote, "I thought it night, but the clock struck noon." Yet the fog had its defenders, artists for one. Painters like James McNeill Whistler and Claude Monet adored the smog's strange light, its blurred edges and ghostly hues. Without the fog, Whistler said, London would be too beautiful. Critics accused him of romanticising pollution. Whistler accused them of having taste. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners were less enchanted. They preferred their sunsets not to taste of sulphur. By the late 19th century, reformers began pushing for cleaner air. The Public Health Acts improved sanitation, but smoke regulation lagged behind. Industry was sacred, air was expendable. It would take decades and tens of thousands more deaths before Parliament acknowledged that fog was more than a quaint nuisance. But even as the smog thickened, the myth persisted that it was part of London's soul, its atmospheric charm. The truth was simpler and sadder. The London particular wasn't romance, it was residue. It represented progress with a cough, Wealth with a shadow, empire under its own cloud, the fog gave the Victorians a perfect metaphor for themselves. Brilliant, industrious, and choking on their own success. The good news, you'll never get lost in London's fog. The bad news, that's because you'll stop moving first. If there's one invention that perfectly captures the moment civilization decided comfort mattered more than character, it's the hot water bottle. Before electricity, before central heating, before anyone had the decency to insulate a wall, the Victorians lived in homes where warmth was a privilege, and often a distant one. But when someone finally figured out that boiling water could be weaponized for coziness, it was nothing short of a domestic revolution. Progress, it turned out, came wrapped in rubber and faintly smelling of burnt hope. To appreciate the miracle of the hot water bottle, you must first understand the dark ages of heating that came before it. For centuries, people relied on whatever they could set on fire: coal, wood, peat, sometimes even dried dung to take the edge off winter. Bedrooms were unheated by design because sleeping cold was considered healthful, an opinion that only made sense if you'd never tried it. The average Victorian woke up every morning with a nose so cold it could file for frostbite, so people improvised. Long before rubber entered the scene, the ancestors of the hot water bottle were bed warmers, metal pans filled with embers shoved between the sheets to preheat the bed. These worked about as safely as they sound. One misplaced spark, and your comfort became cremation. The more cautious used stone pigs, smooth earthenware or soapstone containers filled with hot water and corked. They were effective but heavy enough to double as weapons in domestic disputes. Then came the Victorian golden age of creative scalding. By the early 1800s, inventors began experimenting with copper, tin, and even glass containers designed for bedtime heat. These were called foot warmers, though in practice they heated everything indiscriminately. The well-to-do carried them in carriages, drawing rooms, and even pews. There are documented cases of churchgoers falling asleep mid-sermon, blissfully warmed by their copper companions, spiritual awakening via steam. But the real transformation arrived in the mid-19th century, thanks to an unlikely hero, vulcanized rubber. In the 1840s, American inventor Charles Goodyear discovered that mixing rubber with sulfur and heat produced a material that stayed flexible and heat-resistant, unlike raw rubber, which melted in summer and cracked in winter. This process didn't just revolutionize tires, it revolutionized survival. Suddenly, humanity could manufacture pliable containers that didn't leak, explode, or conduct electricity. It was a short leap from rubber industrial tubing to personal happiness in bottle form. By the 1870s, the modern hot water bottle had entered Victorian homes. The first commercially successful models were made by companies like Hughes's patent portable hot water bottle, a name so proudly literal it barely fit on the label. Early versions were covered in flannel or enclosed in knitted sleeves, because nothing says luxury like hugging something that smells like tyres and tea. The well-bred called them bed companions, though that term caused no small amount of confusion among visitors. The new invention spread rapidly, partly because it solved so many uniquely Victorian problems. It warmed icy sheets, soothed aching joints, and prevented elderly relatives from freezing mid-sentence. Hospitals adopted them as medical marvels, doctors recommended them for everything from chill fevers to uterine torpor, a diagnosis so Victorian it practically wore a corset. For the working class, they were the affordable luxury of winter, portable comfort for bodies worn down by coal smoke and cheap gin. Naturally, the upper classes took things further. The aristocracy commissioned bespoke hot water bottles in silver or porcelain, monogrammed like family heirlooms. One duchess famously had hers lined with ermine, a choice that cost more than the average factory worker's annual wage. Another had hers scented with lavender to disguise the rubber's distinctive aroma, described by one unfortunate gentleman as boiled boots and salvation. Yet for all their prestige, these early hot water bottles were still dangerous companions. Overfilled, they burst spectacularly. Underfilled, they hissed and steamed like temperamental pets. Manufacturers issued pamphlets explaining that scalding accidents may occur if water exceeds 212 degrees, which did nothing to deter people from doing exactly that. The result was an epidemic of minor burns politely referred to in newspapers as domestic misfortunes. Still, most Victorians considered them preferable to death by frost or marriage to a miser with poor insulation. Beyond the bedroom, the humble hot water bottle became a symbol of emotional security. Soldiers carried them during military campaigns. Arctic explorers tucked them under their furs, calling them bottled hearths. Invalids clutched them through long winters as talismans of human ingenuity, proof that technology could occasionally be kind. Children adored them too, often drawing faces on their covers and naming them, because nothing says Victorian childhood like befriending your heating appliance. By the late 19th century, as indoor plumbing and gas heating began creeping into homes, the hot water bottle became less of a luxury and more of a ritual, a bedtime ceremony that signalled the end of the day's labour and the beginning of warmth. The smell of boiling water and rubber meant comfort was imminent, a brief reprieve from the damp chill that seeped through every brick of the empire. It was progress distilled into something you could literally hold. And of course the Victorians romanticised it. Poets wrote about the gentle balm of warmth clasped close. Advertisers leaned into sentimentality, selling bottles as companions to the lonely heart. Housewives knitted covers shaped like cats, dogs, and occasionally Queen Victoria herself. Somewhere along the line, the object that began as practical heat storage became an emblem of domestic tenderness, proof that even an empire obsessed with endurance could occasionally indulge in affection. When electricity finally arrived with its radiators and electric blankets, the hot water bottle refused to die. It persisted, simple, silent, effective. Even today, it remains one of the few Victorian inventions still capable of comforting the human condition without needing batteries, Wi-Fi, or a moral lecture. The good news, you're finally warm. The bad news, so is the patch of skin you just boiled. Prevention to the Victorians was less a medical strategy and more a moral performance. The idea wasn't simply to avoid illness, it was to deserve health. In an age where virtue was measured in discomfort, true wellness meant enduring things that smelled bad, tasted worse, and made you question whether survival was worth it. Prevention, in short, was just another excuse to suffer with dignity. Let's begin with the Victorian wardrobe, mankind's first line of defence against the elements and its last against common sense. The prescription for staying well was simple. Layer up until you resembled an upholstered chair. Doctors and mothers agreed that warmth was health, and modesty was part of the cure. The result was an empire swaddled in flannel, flannel underwear, flannel nightgowns, flannel chest protectors, even flannel bandages. Entire pamphlets were dedicated to the flannel doctrine, insisting it was a prophylactic against every known chill. The only downside was that no one could move. Men sweated through wool waistcoats and drawers that turned into portable saunas. Women wore layer upon layer of petticoats and stays so dense they could deflect mild artillery. Better a red face than a blue corpse, fashion journals cheerfully reminded them. The concept of ventilation was viewed with suspicion. If you left the house and felt the weather, you'd already failed. Children were not spared. Mothers bundled them in scarves, shawls and capes until they achieved the general silhouette of a sofa. The prevailing wisdom was that a shivering child was a moral failing of the parent, while a fainting one was merely warmly disciplined. Schools mandated wool uniforms regardless of season, ensuring that even arithmetic came with mild dehydration. Of course, no Victorian health regimen was complete without cod liver oil, the liquid embodiment of despair. This fishy elixir was advertised as bottled vitality, though most children described it as torture with vitamins. It was believed to cure rickets, ward off colds, and fortify weak constitutions. Parents lined up spoonfuls with grim enthusiasm, confident that the more it burned going down, the better it worked. If you gagged, That was proof of moral impurity leaving the body. For adults, there was an entire pantry of preventive horrors. Sulphur lozenges, camphorated spirits, and vinegar tonics were consumed in heroic quantities. Vinegar, especially, became a cure-all for cleansing, deodorizing, and purifying the blood. Some health guides even suggested bathing in it. Others recommended wearing a vinegar-soaked handkerchief around the neck to repel infection. It did, but it also repelled everyone else. Exercise, too, was reframed as moral medicine. Gentlemen were urged to walk briskly daily, but not fast enough to appear vulgar. Women were encouraged to take the air in moderation, provided they did so under 20 pounds of fabric. Anything more vigorous risked being mistaken for indecency. For those too frail to leave home, there were indoor calisthenics, essentially synchronized fidgeting in corsets. Diet played a crucial role in prevention, guided by the sacred Victorian rule. If it tastes awful, it must be keeping you alive. Blandness was next to godliness. Strong spices and rich sauces were thought to excite the passions, so they were replaced with gruel, boiled cabbage, and moral restraint. Breakfast was porridge that could double as wallpaper paste. Dinner might include boiled beef, grey, virtuous, and only slightly distinguishable from shoe leather. Temperance in all things, physicians advised, especially pleasure. Water itself was suspect, especially in cities. The solution was to boil it into tea, an act of national genius that combined caffeine, scalding temperatures, and denial. Tea drinking became both preventive and patriotic. Doctors wrote papers praising its stimulating yet chastening properties, and mothers dosed their children with milky brews to steady the nerves. If you didn't like tea, you could always sterilize your insides with a modest tot of gin, purely medicinal, of course. Then there was the ritual of ventilation, that great paradox of Victorian health. Fresh air was believed to strengthen the constitution, but draughts could kill you instantly. The result was an architectural compromise. Open one window for exactly 3 minutes a day, preferably while everyone else was in another room. Some manuals advised hanging damp sheets across doorways to filter miasmas, ensuring that any passing air arrived suffocatingly humid but morally purified. Moral restraint naturally extended to the emotions. Doctors warned that excessive laughter could disturb the lungs, while excitement overheated the blood. The ideal Victorian preventive mindset was calm, moderate, and vaguely miserable. Happiness was not a medical goal, merely a potential health risk. The wealthy, with access to country estates, had additional advantages: clean air, open fields, and the ability to pay other people to freeze in their stead. They embraced preventive leisure, hunting, riding, and gardening, under the theory that dirt built immunity. Meanwhile, the working class got plenty of dirt but somehow missed the immunity part. Public health reformers began advocating sunshine, soap, and sobriety, a slogan that neatly excluded anyone who couldn't afford windows or downtime. Still, for all the absurdity, some of these measures did work, at least by accident. Wool kept people warm, cod liver oil provided vitamin D, and tea saved thousands from waterborne diseases. The Victorian obsession with moral cleanliness slowly evolved into genuine hygiene. It turned out that while guilt doesn't kill germs, boiling water does. By the end of the century, prevention began shifting from moral lecture to medical science. Germ theory took the wheel, and layer up and pray was gradually replaced with wash your hands and ventilate properly. But the spirit of stoic suffering lingered. Even today, when someone says, "it builds character," they are channeling the ghost of a Victorian mother with a spoonful of cod liver oil and a very smug wool petticoat. The good news? The cod liver oil is working. The bad news? So is your gag reflex. Every modern winter comfort, from central heating to cough drops that don't contain opium, exists because the Victorians suffered first. They froze, coughed, and occasionally boiled themselves for the greater good of medical progress. It wasn't intentional. Of course, the Victorians didn't set out to invent modern medicine. They simply kept trying to survive with creativity and questionable logic until someone smarter finally connected the dots. Their misery was, in retrospect, research just conducted without consent or safety standards. The first lesson the Victorians taught us is that progress and common sense rarely arrive at the same time. For much of the 19th century, prevention meant layering yourself in wool and praying the germs got lost. Doctors prescribed mercury for fevers, arsenic for energy, and whiskey for everything else. Public health, meanwhile, was an experimental genre, half sanitation, half sermon. Yet amid all the confusion, something extraordinary happened. Medicine evolved step by soot-choked step, from moral theory to measurable science. We owe them our modern obsession with hygiene. Before the Victorians, people thought cleanliness was decorative. By the time they were done scrubbing, it was destiny. The discovery of germs shattered centuries of superstition, and suddenly soap became civilization's most powerful weapon. Victorian mothers taught children to wash not for vanity but survival. Hospitals introduced sterilization. The simple act of boiling water stopped being housework and became public health policy. Every modern hand sanitizer is, in spirit, a tiny monument to some Victorian doctor who lost an argument about invisible bacteria and then changed history. They also taught us the value of infrastructure, though it took several decades and one or two cholera epidemics to realise it. The Victorians learned the hard way that bad plumbing kills faster than bad manners. Sewers, clean water and proper drainage transformed cities from death traps into livable spaces. Joseph Basil Jett's London sewers, for instance, remain one of the few 19th century projects that didn't explode, collapse, or smell worse afterward. Today, when we flush a toilet without fearing divine retribution, we owe a nod to the engineers who refused to let civilization drown in its own enthusiasm. The next great inheritance from their suffering is winter healthcare itself, the idea that cold weather illnesses can be managed rather than merely endured. Victorians had no vaccines, no antibiotics, and limited insulation, yet their relentless documentation of disease laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology. Their hospital records, autopsy notes, and even their panic gave scientists patterns to study. What they called consumption we now know as tuberculosis, curable, preventable, and no longer fashionable. What they called ague, or chill fever, we now treat with antibiotics and central heating, not vinegar and prayer. From a modern perspective, it's almost endearing how convinced they were that morality was medicine. Virtue, they said, keeps the lungs pure. In reality, it was ventilation. But that misplaced confidence gave rise to something useful: public health education. Their moral lectures evolved into hygiene campaigns, then vaccination drives, then public wellness programs. The message stayed the same: behave responsibly or die coughing. But the science got significantly better. We also inherited a few questionable ideas that took longer to unlearn. For instance, the Victorian fondness for tonics never truly vanished. It merely rebranded itself into wellness culture. Swap laudanum for kale smoothies, and you'll see the resemblance. The obsession with purifying the body through dubious substances. Still going strong. Every detox tea and oxygen bar is a faint echo of a quack in 1870 selling Dr. Fairweather's elixir of eternal immunity. The packaging improved, the nonsense stayed remarkably stable. Yet not all their instincts were wrong. Victorians, for all their drama, understood the emotional side of illness. They believed recovery required not just medicine but morale. Hospitals were built with gardens, windows and fresh air, not for aesthetics but for spirit. They recognised that despair could be as deadly as disease. In their overwrought way, they stumbled onto holistic care long before modern psychologists put it in textbooks. The lesson endures. Healing isn't just physical. Even if your doctor no longer prescribes sea air and stoicism, the sentiment behind it survives in every wellness retreat and therapy session. Perhaps their most enduring gift, though, is resilience. The Victorians didn't have comfort, but they had grit. They trudged through fog, frost and filth armed only with scarves, spoons of cod liver oil, and a spectacular capacity for denial. They found dignity in endurance and humour in hardship, two medicines that still outperform most prescriptions. Their lives were brutal, but their determination to improve them laid the foundation for ours. Today we wrap ourselves in heated blankets, take flu shots, and sip honey tea while complaining about drafts, luxuries the Victorians could only imagine. Our winter sniffles rarely turn into epidemics, and our remedies rarely double as torture. But the irony is that our comfort is built entirely on their discomfort. The countless failures, frostbites, and fatal misdiagnoses of the 19th century collectively birthed a medical system that finally knows the difference between a chill and cholera. When we laugh at their absurd treatments, mustard poultices, vinegar socks, snow rubbing, it's worth remembering that they were doing their best with what they had. Every terrible remedy was a step towards something better. Every misguided cure was an experiment in progress. They didn't know where the line was between superstition and science, so they drew it in the frost and kept walking. And if there's a moral to their misery, it's this: humanity's capacity to learn is directly proportional to its ability to endure embarrassment. The Victorians gave us the gift of trial by absurdity, proving that even a society armed with soot corsets and cod liver oil could stumble toward enlightenment. So yes, they froze, they coughed, they gargled mercury and called it a progress. But without them, winter would still be a season of survival instead of a mild inconvenience with festive sweaters. The good news: the Victorians taught us how not to die of frostbite. The bad news: they did most of the dying first.